Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Charles, or simply Charles, as he had been called for about 15 years, was walking slowly through the winter forest. There was a hard frost. The snow clinked under his feet, and it was rapidly getting dark. Soon the nightlife would soon begin in the forest. The elderly man had worked as a forester for almost half a century. Nearly 47 years is a long time. Charles liked his work. He loved the forest from childhood and understood that trees soothed him, gave him strength and energy. You could trust them with any secrets. Charles did so in his younger years with any offense, with any worry. He flew headlong into the thicket to tell a birch or a dream about his trouble. And those silently listened, sympathetically shook the crowns, and as it seemed then, to little Charles, they comforted the boy in their own language, which few people understood. Charles also loved animals. He fed forest inhabitants, spent hours watching the life of squirrels or birds. But Charles did not get along with people. Unlike trees and birds, they did not understand him, considered him strange, stupid, and lazy. Even his own parents scolded their son dreamily and thoughtfully for not helping much with household chores. Peers never accepted Charles in their company, and the boy did not want to. He was much more interested in the measured and fascinating forest life. There was no place for envy, lies, sycophants, that everything is as honest and logical as possible. And Charles chose a profession to match his character. Became a forester to live in a forest gatehouse, to look after a confident plot, constantly hear pleasant sounds familiar from childhood. At first, the man could not believe his happiness. Charles did his work well. Even now, being already old, the man did not want to leave his post, as he would have to return to the village again, and there was nothing and no one there. Charles never married, never had a family, which, by the way, he never regretted. Despite the prophecies, acquaintances and relatives of his parents have long been gone. Brother and sister moved to the city. There are, of course, in the village acquaintances, neighbors, but communication with them is tiresome. Charles had to pretend to be interested, listening to boring things, giving a nod. The man didn't like all that. The woods beckoned to him as strongly as ever. That was why the older man was still in no hurry to part with his position. Now he had gone out before going to bed to inspect Charles's controlled possessions. He had already made his evening rounds this evening, but he had a feeling. Something was definitely wrong. Uncharacteristic sounds and phenomena disturbed the forest. The night birds had sounded earlier, as if they had been frightened away. The trees were making strange noises. No, we should go out and survey the area. In so many years of forestry, Charles had learned to trust his instincts. He had to get into a thick down jacket and huge felt boots, put on mittens and a cap. Just in case, the man took a gun. There was no chance. He was not afraid of forest animals. The people who came under the cover of night to the pine forest worried him much more. It was getting dark fast. It became difficult to see anything in the thickening twilight. Charles took out a flashlight as the man went deeper into the thicket. His anxiety grew. Suddenly, the light from a handheld spotlight was caught in a circle of light. It looked too unnatural against the pure, snowy blanket of chest-deep tracks. The man rushed to the find. Up close, it turned out to be a freezing woman of about 60 years old, dressed only in pants, blouse, and house slippers. In this frosty weather, pale skin, blue lips, the uninvited guests were almost asleep. Another 10 minutes in this cold, and that's it. It'll be too late to do anything. How did she end up in the middle of nowhere? You don't just wander in here by accident. And why is the woman so lightly dressed? All right, all questions later. Right now, we need to save the man. Charles disemboweled the stranger. She barely closed her eyelids. Seeing the man, she was not surprised in the slightest. The forester pulled off his down jacket. A warm woolen sweater would hold him up. Wrapped a woman in a jacket. She couldn't walk anymore. So the man dragged her in his arms in total darkness because he had no flashlight to hold now. rather into the old woman, saving warmth to the stove riding heat. Fortunately, the woman turned out not to be large, and Charles was strong, despite his respectable age. In the cabin, the man looked a stranger, half sleepy, but chilly pale, but no signs of frostbite were yet visible on the exposed parts of her body. Apparently, she hadn't been out in the cold that long. Still, we must act. The man put the stranger in a chair. She, having found herself in warmth, began to recover quickly. Now she was shivering, whether it was chills or stress from the experience. It was clear that something terrible had happened. Charles gave her one of his woolen sweaters. The woman quickly pulled it on and wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the shivering. Charles, meanwhile, placed a basin of nearly hot water in front of her, offering to soak her feet. She should go to the bathhouse now, to steam her to the bone. The forester had his own bathhouse in the yard, but it would take so long for it to be trampled, and the woman needed to get warm as soon as possible. The woman looked gratefully at Charles and dipped her feet into the water. The silent but clearly kind host was already serving her a large cup of warm milk and honey. "Thank you," the stranger finally managed to squeeze out. Charles took a closer look at her. She was not a poor woman, judging by her clothes. She probably lived in the city, but she didn't look like a country woman. And there's so much fear and pain in her eyes. "My name is Miranda, and I'm Charles Lesnick. As always, confused and lost when meeting new people. Huntsman, I'm local. Thank you so much. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here anymore. It's freezing. Would you like an ambulance?" "No," Miranda didn't call an ambulance. "I feel fine already. We need to call the police right away. Do you have a phone?" "Yes, I do." "Call the service phone. Get a squad now. I'm in danger." "Maybe you are too." "And my son. My son is in great danger." Now Charles hastily pulled a cell phone from the shelf, with large buttons and the tone of a woman. And the strange situation itself was not one to be doubted. Surely something terrible had happened. There was no time to find out what it was. "Why? What should I tell them?" Charles asked, listening to the long beeps on the phone. "I'll do the talking." Miranda took the phone firmly from his hands. Charles didn't mind talking to people, not his specialty. "Send the police right away." In a panicked voice, Miranda spoke into the phone. She checked the location with Charles and dictated it clearly, despite her trembling, to the officer on duty. "Where to go? A dangerous man tried to get rid of me. He's crazy, but he's very smart. His name is Jacob. Ran out of the hospital to run a photo database. Now he's probably headed to Pirogov Hospital in the city. Send a unit there too. My son James. He's in danger." Charles listened and tried to make sense of someone trying to get rid of Miranda. Someone who had escaped from a mental institution and was on their way to the woman's son. What kind of thriller? Charles had never experienced as much in his long life as he had in this half hour. Finally, Miranda pressed the reset button. "At first we didn't believe it," she informed Charles. "I could hear in my voice that they didn't believe it. But I convinced them. The police are on their way. They're taking her to the hospital. I wish we had time. I wish we hadn't." The forester just nodded his head. "I see." Although, of course, he understood nothing. But it was not in his nature to pile questions on his interlocutor, even in this strange situation. Charles silently sat down at the table and began to fix the large moldy basket. Physical labor always calmed him down. The woman began her story by herself. It was a long confession, and Charles was the perfect listener. He listened to every word and never once interrupted. He understood that I needed to speak, and it was interesting, of course, how she found herself at night in the forest without outerwear and warm shoes. Miranda grew up in an ordinary Soviet family, a mom, a dad, a younger brother. At school, the girl studied diligently, but did not have stars from the sky. A solid heel. Miranda also studied at a music studio, mastered the piano. That's what her parents wanted. The girl from an early age tried to meet the expectations of mom and dad, so after the 11th grade, she entered the pedagogical college. Parents wanted their daughter to become a teacher in due time. Miranda married a boy from the son's good family, a colleague of her father's. The parents on both sides were happy. They helped the newlyweds get a separate 2-room apartment. Miranda felt quite happy in the marriage. Mason turned out to be an attentive and caring husband, an interesting conversationalist, a reliable friend. Young people studied, worked, traveled, met with friends. Everything was good, just wonderful. But a couple of years after the wedding, the parents of the husband and wife began to demand grandchildren. Mason also dreamed of a child, and Miranda herself already felt that she was ready to become a mother, but nothing worked out. Years went by, and the cherished pregnancy did not come. This overshadowed the happiness of the young family, made it incomplete. Peers have already brought up babies, many more than one. But to them, the stork was not in a hurry. Of course, the spouses examined, but whether the medicine at that time was not at the height, or whether there was really no reason. Only they did not find any abnormalities in either Mason. Doctors waved their hands, advised to wait and try, and even more rest. Eat right, less stressed. Nothing helped. Her peers' children were already in school. Miranda could not calmly look at children's things. Tears came to her eyes. She worked as an elementary school teacher, interacting with babies every day. She should have had a son like that by now, or a daughter. Every month that passed in vain caused bouts of despair tears. The woman was angry at fate, envied the young parents. She felt incomplete. Forget and live a full life did not work. When there was no strength to endure mental anguish, and the hope for pregnancy evaporated completely, Miranda offered her husband another option. She thought it over for a long time, weighed the pros and cons, and came to the conclusion that she was ready for it. How about taking a child from someone else's orphanage? Mason looked confused. Maybe we should wait a little longer. Let's try a new treatment. I'm not sure I can take someone else's baby. There's no such thing as an alien baby. Miranda cut him off. And the treatment? What's there to treat? The doctors say there's nothing wrong with us, but there's still no baby. Since then, the woman began to purposely treat her husband, pushing him to a serious decision. By all means, she needs a child of her own to walk with him, to bring him up, to teach him to dress up in beautiful costumes, to feed the taste of no one, to discuss with her friends the successes and failures of her favorite child. Miranda dreamed of showing the tiny man this world, to familiarize him with nature and its wonders, to give her son or daughter a lot of positive emotions and feelings. And then, when the husband was already not against adoption, then Miranda accidentally saw a program about orphanages in a neighboring region. My heart clenched at the sight of abandoned poor babies. To someone, children are given too easily, undeservedly easily. How can one give up such a miracle? Miranda had always been more inclined towards her daughter. I wanted to forbid her to make pigtails, sew dresses, buy dolls. And in general, girls, they are so tender, such cute dolls just. But on the TV screen, she saw a 3-year-old boy named James, and she realized she was lost. Skinny, blonde, snub-nosed. He was funny, and the little boy looked with his blue, wide-open eyes straight into her soul. There was so much warmth in that look, the curiosity of defenselessness, all of it. And she didn't want to take that boy into a family as soon as possible. James, you need the warmth and care of a family right now. The thought that in the orphanage this baby could be abused made me sick. That evening, Miranda was able to finally convince her husband that they absolutely needed a foster child. Mason finally agreed, and the next weekend the couple drove to the neighboring region, to the same orphanage where James lived. Miranda arranged in advance by phone to meet with the baby at the same time and asked about his health. It turned out that James is surprisingly trouble-free, and the baby. Strange, of course. Why such a handsome and healthy baby is still not in the family. Miranda had studied the issue of foster parenting and understood perfectly well behind such gifts usually coup. Apparently, they were just very, very lucky. It's fate. But in the orphanage, it became clear why such a beautiful, healthy child has not yet found parents. True, not immediately, but only after the acquaintance with the baby took place. James at first looked at Mason and Miranda warily, but with curiosity. In the first minutes, he did not want to take their presents, but then he got bolder, got used to it. Every minute, Miranda fell in love with the boy more and more. She liked everything about him: his facial expressions, his gestures, his voice, even his smell. So familiar, so his own. Mason melted too. He looked at the baby with such tenderness that Miranda realized that there would be no problems with her husband. Already after this touching meeting, sitting in the principal's office, the potential adoptive parents learned more about James. It turns out that in the same orphanage as brought up in his older brother, 4-year-old Jacob, the boys were born to a very young, but already hard-drinking mother, who their father, or rather fathers, are unknown. A dysfunctional family often came to the attention of the guardianship authorities. The children were not taken away from the mother. Poorly, but she coped with the upbringing of her sons. And then a terrible thing happened. The mother of the kids, during another drinking binge, died at the hands of a cohabitant. The children at that moment were in the apartment. They were sleeping in the next room. Miranda and Mason looked at each other confused. Yet, James had been through a lot, but he'd be with his family soon. They'll make sure he has a happy childhood. We'd like to take the boy as soon as possible, Miranda said. It's not that simple. The headmistress shook her head. As I have already informed you, James has a brother, and the boys can only be adopted together. There's no other way. Miranda felt like she'd been hit over the head with something heavy. She already saw herself as a mom to the middle, a sweet, trusting baby with blonde curly ears. Another baby didn't fit into that picture in any way. One could meet Jacob. Mason had already asked the principal specific questions. Unlike Miranda, he didn't seem uncomfortable with the possibility of fathering 2 boys at once. Strange, considering he hadn't agreed to one until a short time ago. This is a healthy boy too, but he's a little older. You know, with the characters and all. We want to see him. Miranda finally made up her mind. Jacob. She initially perceived him as an obstacle to her own family happiness, in addition to the cute baby James, which will have to endure. Jacob was even in appearance strikingly different from his younger brother. Dark-skinned with a hedgehog of stiff dark hair at his head. But most notable was his gaze, prickly, distrustful, and surprisingly perceptive for a child of such a tender age. What? That expression on the boy's face and movements immediately alerted Miranda. But the desire to take James away was stronger than intuition and common sense. Jacob looked at the adoptive parents, assessing at the questions, answering reluctantly at. But he made an unpleasant impression, something she shared with her husband in the car on the way home. Well, what do you want? The child grew up first with a dysfunctional mother of Alka's, then in the orphanage fell. How else is he supposed to look? Mason's clearly got his heart set on fatherhood. The thought of having 2 sons in their family opened him up. Just imagine, we're going to have 2 eagles at once. It's such joy and pride. 2 brothers, 2 friends. It's so powerful. Always considered brothers, by the way. Miranda didn't share her husband's enthusiasm. Something about Jacob alarmed and repulsed her. She wanted to take from the orphanage only one James, sweet native baby. But that was impossible. Either 2 or none. And that's how Miranda and Mason came into the family. 2 sons at once, 4-year-old Jacob and 3-year-old James. The parents prepared for the boys' arrival by designing a spacious nursery for them. Finally, Miranda was not in pain, but excited about shopping in children's stores. She bought her sons a whole mountain of toys and books, bedding with cars, cozy, warm, bathrobes, a lamp in the form of Mickey Mouse. The joyful clutter before the arrival of my sons was exhilarating and positive. In the end, Miranda convinced herself that it was great. Having 2 children in the family at once, the boys would have a lot of fun together. Still, The age difference wasn't that big. The children were adapting differently. James was curious and followed the territory, looking for contact with his new parents. And Jacob was quiet. For the first week, he was frozen, sitting on his bed, cuddled up with his teddy bear. He could stare at the same spot for hours. He wouldn't respond to requests. He'd answer questions with one-word answers and barely ate anything. It turned out that it was the calmest period of life, grown twice in the family, because then the eldest broke up in full force and showed his true temper. It all started with messing things up. Jacob once just took a felt-tip pen and painted fresh wallpaper in the nursery. It was a shame about the repairs that had been made, but she understood the boy's behavior. After all, he's a child. It's inherent in children to spoil things. They learn from their mistakes. Miranda had a long talk with Jacob. She didn't scold him, didn't rebuke him. She simply told him why he shouldn't draw on the wallpaper and why he should keep his home safe. The little boy, accordingly, nodded attentively, looking into the eyes of his foster mother, and that same evening painted the walls in the hallway, hall, and kitchen. When she demanded an explanation, Jacob only smiled enigmatically. From his look, the woman realized the boy had done it on purpose out of spite. More to come. The painted wallpaper was just a flower. Broken appliances, broken dishes thrown out the window, notebooks that Miranda took home to check. It was as if Jacob had a specific goal each time to piss Miranda off. If the woman held back, blaming the unacceptable behavior on the stresses of adapting a child, the boy did something even more impressive. Mason assured her that everything could be fixed with love and care, as if Miranda hadn't tried. She always bought toys and candy for both children. She took both of them to amusement parks and cafes and read books to them before bedtime, and practiced with the kids, reading and drawing, and talked a lot with her sons and hugged them constantly. James with Jacob's sincere pleasure through and through. But that was all by now. Except that James responded to all this reciprocated love and tenderness, and even tried to care in his own way. About the figures. That water will pour, or candy guests. He could just run up to Miranda sitting on the notebooks and snuggle up to her shoulder. At such moments, the woman's heart melted with tenderness. Jacob, on the other hand, seemed to have no feelings for his adoptive parents. The complete indifference in his eyes was sometimes replaced by anger and irritation. No matter how much Miranda tried to make the boy feel comfortable, no matter how much time she devoted to him personally, it was all in vain. It was like hitting a concrete wall with your head in kindergarten. Jacob was only there for 6 months. He behaved there just disgusting. He insulted children, was rude to educators, threw food, and enjoyed the effect. Soon there were complaints from teachers, and then parents collected signatures for Jacob to be transferred to a special kindergarten. But he realized the child has obvious problems. He needs a special approach. Correctional kindergartens have specialists who know how to work with such kids. A garden for the mentally retarded. This suggestion angered Miranda to the core. Jacob grew up a very intelligent child, grasping everything literally on the fly, despite his terrible behavior. No, Miranda couldn't let Jacob go to an institution. To live with the wolves is to howl with the wolves. The woman was convinced that the environment would have a negative effect on her eldest son. There would be a setback in development, and nothing good would happen. But even in a regular kindergarten, with such an attitude, educators, administration, parents, the boy to leave is not the case. The spouses consulted and decided that Miranda will temporarily leave work and will be engaged in children, will pay special attention. Jacob will become for him a mother, educator, and teacher in one person. And then, when the boy would recover, Miranda would return to school. This decision was hard for the woman. Still, she loved her job very much. But the children were more important, especially since they had waited so long for them. Now she was with Jacob in a 24/7 mode. It was very hard. The boy invented new ways to drive her crazy, and he was good at it. When his mother got used to the next antics and stopped reacting, he would find her next sore spot. "You're fat," Jacob said with a cheeky grin to Miranda as she tried on a new sundress in front of the mirror. "Fat, and you stink." Then she was taken aback. The child's words hurt her heart. A little later, the woman remembered that she had recently talked to a friend on the phone about dieting. Miranda was planning to lose a couple of pounds for a summer trip to the sea. Apparently, Jacob had overheard and was now using that information to hurt her. No, if Jacob needed something, he could find a way to approach the parents and get his way. Especially effective his charms worked on Mason, who sincerely pitied his eldest son, considered the problems with his behavior as a consequence of psychological trauma and allowed him too much. Cartoons till 2 o'clock. Yes, please. Tomorrow's a day off anyway. And Jacob is so sweetly asking to play a computer game for an hour. Okay, I can have chocolate cake instead of a full lunch at the request of the older nobody. Okay, you can indulge once in a while. Miranda was getting terribly annoyed by all of this. She tried to keep Jacob in line. If the boy does not perceive Cares's kind attitude, then at least the training should work. But she didn't meet her husband's understanding. You just couldn't love him. Sadly shook his head husband in response to another request of his wife to be more strict with his eldest son. "I'm sorry, but it was obvious that you liked James better." And the behavior? Miranda was on the verge of despair. "You're at work all day. I'm the one fighting him. You just don't even see what he's doing. What's the behavior? Yeah, he messes things up. He doesn't listen. All the boys do it. Especially since he's injured. Don't forget the conditions Jacob had to spend the first few years of his life in." But soon Mason had to admit there was something wrong with Jacob. The boy, who at the time of his adoption was going to the bathroom, suddenly started wetting the bed at night. At first, the parents thought it was the result of an illness, and the child was not to blame. But then it turned out, Jacob definitely does wetting on purpose. How else to explain that every morning put under the sheet client lay on the floor? And it was the mattress, which is almost impossible to clean. He couldn't have done all this in his sleep. Miranda tried to get through to Jacob, find out the cause of his new problem. But as always, to no avail. "Is this your way of attracting attention?" the woman asked, looking intently into the boy's expressionless black eyes. "You are already 70 soon to go to school. Aren't you ashamed? Tell us how we should behave so that you don't get angry." Jacob only smirked. And this cheeky smile was another proof that the kid can control himself quite well. He deliberately pisses off his foster parents, angers them, as if he's getting revenge for something. Except for what? For being taken from the orphanage. They bought a lot of nice clothes and toys and take them to the sea. Good food. For not having to leave his job for him. James attended his group faithfully, made friends at the daycare center, and didn't have to study with Jacob at home. And it was hard, thankless, and very unpleasant labor. Mason disappeared all day at work and could not fully understand his wife. Soon Jacob had another favorite pastime of embarrassing his parents in crowded places. It could happen anywhere, on a walk in the park, in the store. Jacob suddenly began to demand something that is obviously impossible to fulfill. For example, to pet an elephant in the zoo or ride a helicopter. Having received a refusal, the kid threw a tantrum, and even what his own on the ground or floor convulsions, and tears, loud cries. Of course, the surrounding people were not indifferent to these scenes. Stopped, looked, something to advise with condemnation, looked at, blushing. Their parents, who could not bring up the child normally. The boy grew up, became smarter, and invented more and more sophisticated ways to influence his foster mother. Jacob began to hurt everyone Miranda loved. It all started with the family's favorite cat, Old Lady Moose. At first, Jacob just beat her by dragging her tail. Poor thing, accustomed to love and respect, did not know where to hide from the little tormentor. Punishments did not help. Jacob continued to abuse the cat. And then he cut her hair, or rather, lined her fur with ugly masculine privates. Apparently, the poor animal lashed out in the process, because there were cuts all over her body, Or maybe Jacob hurt her on purpose. That would not have surprised Miranda in the least. That's when the woman was first really scared. There was a vicious, unknown creature living in the apartment with them. He's already picked up a pair of scissors. Who knows what will come into his head next time? What else? Jacob had also started to hurt James. Before, strangely enough, he hadn't touched his brother, hadn't paid any attention to him at all. Miranda had heard stories from acquaintances about their children fighting. Nothing like that had ever happened for them. Jacob and James existed as if in parallel worlds, which practically did not intersect, did not play together, but did not quarrel. Now James often came to his mother bruised and bruised. Jacob threw at his brother for any reason not so answered, accidentally took his thing, walked too close to his bed. And also the older one influenced the younger one, psychologically intimidated by monsters, allegedly living in the closet and under the bed, assured that their parents would soon give them back to the nursery and home. The vivacious, cheerful James became unlike himself. Pale, silent, withdrawn, anxious eyes constantly on the wet spot, crying at the drop of a hat. And it was not painful to look at the metamorphosis happening to her favorite baby. And it's all his fault. Jacob, this boy, makes their family's life unbearable. On purpose. How Miranda hated this evil creature. How disgusted was she by Jacob's hovering voice. Miranda had been meaning to take her eldest son to a doctor for a long time. His behavior was becoming increasingly abnormal and frightening, but she was in no hurry to see a doctor. If the child is put on the register, it could affect his future life. Although she does not have any warm feelings for Jacob, she still feels responsible for him. But the incident with the cat has shown that they can't wait any longer. They are all exhausted by Jacob's behavior. Mason has a heart condition. He doesn't need this kind of stress. And James, on the development of Happiness Brothers' antics, are clearly not good. No, we can't go on like this. Miranda made an appointment for her son. She waited with bated breath for a consultation with one of the most experienced pediatricians in the city. Maybe a miracle would happen and the doctor would prescribe pills that would solve the problem once and for all. At the appointment, Miranda marveled at Jacob. He was suddenly transformed beyond recognition. On the chair in front of the old woman in a white coat sat a focused, serious boy with impeccable manners. All the things that Jacob told Professor Miranda before the examination did not get involved with this sweet, obedient child. The doctor talked to the boy for a long time, asking questions, asking him to talk about his hobbies and pastimes. Jacob answered in such a way that Miranda did not recognize the elder. First of all, it turned out that the son has a competently well-arranged speech. He has a virtuoso voice. He also seemed to have an innate gift of persuasion. It was a maximally adequate brought-up child, not priceless. Deprived of peace, the whole family, the doctor suggested Jacob undergo some tests. Over the boy's shoulder, she peered at his work and nodded to herself as if she saw confirmation of conclusions already reached. Then the doctor, with an affectionate smile, asked Jacob to step into the playroom. "Well," she said, looking sternly at Miranda, "it is clear to me. The child is absolutely healthy and even more, ahead of his peers in intellectual development. But the child is in constant anxiety. He is in permanent stress. And it's all about jealousy. You seem to separate your adopted sons. Do you love one? The Jacob you've never been able to accept." The child can sense that. That's not true. It wasn't important to prove to this woman professor that Jacob and their whole family needed help. "I do a lot with Jacob. I quit my job for him. And he does terrible things. I'm starting to fear him. Your motives are perfectly clear to me." The doctor's voice became icy and hard. "You took 2 boys from an orphanage, but you miscalculated your strength. Now you need a doctor's note, so that with peace of mind to give the older child back to the orphanage, and at the same time, so that your youngest favorite is not taken away. They say the orphanage administration lied, hid the diagnosis. You know how many of you Parivis are like that. You're wrong. She's already realized she can't get any help here. I'm right. But you should have realized before you adopted kids that they're not kittens. Miranda returned home in the darkest of moods. She had so much hope for this doctor's appointment, but it looked like there was no way out. Jacob continued to be the model boy for a while longer. For some reason, this discovery may have frightened Miranda more than pleased her. Jacob is not just a sick child who throws tantrums and can't control his behavior. No, it turns out he is. He has a masterful way of handling himself, of getting people to like him. It's so weird. I mean, he's just a kid. He's only starting school this year, and he's already so talented at acting. How can I live with him? He's going to grow up. He's going to be strong. I'm scared for myself, for my husband, for James. Miranda used to get really scared when Jacob would hang up. It happened to him, like twice a day. Right, he'd sit there and stare at himself with a blank stare, and then he'd look away. It's a creepy picture. And it was useless to call out to him. He'd just pass out. Often it happened during especially long lectures from his parents. It seemed to the woman that he was in some unknown world. But in general, Jacob loved attention. Miranda noticed it almost immediately. He needed to be begged, persuaded, even scolded. As long as Talik was seen. The woman, knowing this peculiarity, her son often reacted to his antics with complete indifference. But others showed up: doctors, relatives, neighbors. The more around Jacob beat adults gradually losing control over emotions, the happier the boy looked. It was time for Jacob to become a first grader. At the first meeting at school, Miranda heard from the teacher a lot of raves about the older and smart he is, and grasps everything on the fly. Can read, draws beautifully, counts in the mind better than 4 classmates. Well done, Mom. Well done. You've prepared your child for school. A young teacher would be so enthusiastic. Miranda again marveled. She didn't prepare Jacob for school. Or rather, she tried, of course, but he refused to study with her, throwing pens and notebooks, throwing tantrums, calling her names. Where did what come from? The doctor at the appointment talked about Jacob's high intelligence. That seems to be true. And his talent for pissing off everyone around him, manipulating, pretending, was also a clear indication that Jacob was far from stupid. Miranda hoped that Jacob would find himself at school, become interested in learning, grow up, change, reconsider his behavior, but of course it was not enough for long. The teacher called Miranda almost every day and complained about Jacob, that he sits under the desk during the lesson and sings songs from there. Then he goes through the teacher's closet. Then he takes things from his classmates right out of their briefcases. He fights and calls names. All of this with a great intellect, made for a couple of minutes test for excellent instant answer to any question asked on the topic of the lesson. Maybe he's bored in a regular school, the teacher asked hopefully. He should go to another one, specially for gifted children. Miranda, as no one realized, is a young colleague. She, too, wants to get rid of this evil monster that seems to be beyond repair. Things were getting harder at home. Jacob still insulted James and hurt him, physically damaged things, did everything in defiance of his parents, and wet the mattress every night. How many of them had to be changed in just 6 months? It's scary to remember the hysteria on any occasion, added threats, scary, creepy wishes to his parents and brother. But most disturbing of all were his nightly vigils. From the very beginning, Jacob slept very little, took a long time to fall asleep, woke up before dawn, and wandered around the apartment, lighting the gas, rattling pots, and loud music. It was unbearable for everyone at home. Toward the end of first grade, the teacher's council decided to send Jacob to the doctor. Miranda rejoiced. There was no getting away from her now. Jacob had made a mistake and shown his true colors. The school could not ignore the statements of teachers and parents of his classmates. So Jacob was given a certificate of diagnosis. For this, it was necessary to lie in the hospital several times. The boy was recommended treatment and home teaching. Miranda hoped that the pills and treatments would perform a miracle. Jacob's behavior would change, and it would still be possible to grow a normal person out of him. But dreams of a happy future were not to be realized. The treatment had an effect. Now Jacob at least slept well at night. But overall, things got worse. From the medication, the boy became something for breaking, something like a zombie. And this state made the boy angry. He hated the pills, hated his parents forcing him to take them, angry at the world for taking him out of school. Now the teachers were coming to his house, and Jacob had so many potential victims in his class of as many as 30 classmates. And how fun was it to bully them, to manipulate them? And now what? Only a mother, long accustomed to the antics of a troubled son, and therefore does not give the necessary emotions. Miranda increasingly thought about returning Jacob to the orphanage. This child is severely diagnosed. When she took him in, she didn't know anything about it. So it makes sense. James will stay with the family and Jacob will go back into the system and let the professionals there with the right knowledge and education work with him. And she's not coping. She's having a hard time not only with the constant antics of the older Jacob, but also with how this kind of life is affecting Mason and James. The woman was afraid to admit it to herself, but she hoped that one day her eldest son would simply not come home, run away from a walk, go away with someone, or he would be taken away. Jacob was constantly, despite her repeated warnings, walking in unsafe areas of the junkyard, picked up vacant lots. Whether he was really beckoned, such locations, or as usual despite his parents tried to spite his husband from the constant stress and inability to relax, aggravated heart problems, he drinks pills by the handful and often feels bad. James, he's growing up insecure and intimidated. Poor little guy by nature. He's very sensitive, kind. And why should they all suffer like this? The family was reminded of what a normal life was like. Only during Jacob's hospitalization in the hospital. Now that the boy was diagnosed, he had to go to the hospital from time to time. The housemates always looked forward to this event, a break from the endless tantrums and threats, not having to constantly repair, throw out and clean something. It was so pleasant that Miranda more and more often talked to her husband about officially giving up their eldest son. Mason at first discouraged his wife from going to the orphanage. How do you bring that back? It's not like he's a kitten. They took him in, so they have to raise him, treat him. And how can you live with the idea that the child was abandoned? But Jacob did everything he could to get back into the orphanage. Eventually, Mason gave up too. The man had long planned to buy a new car and purposefully saved for his dream. Jacob was well aware of his father's desire. More than once he heard conversations of adults. And so, finally, Mason found the right option. He withdrew money from the bank the day before because the seller asked him to pay in cash. The stack of new bills was in the drawer of the dresser that stood in Mason and Miranda's bedroom. In the morning, the woman woke up to her husband screaming. It turns out that Mason had pulled out the dresser drawer to retrieve the money. An hour later, he had an appointment with the salesman, but the man was in for an unpleasant surprise. Instead of a stack of bills intercepted with a clerical rubber band. In the drawer, he found a piece of paper on which was drawn a mockingly grinning face of Mickey Mouse Jacob. There was no one else to take the money, and he was the only one in their family who could draw so professionally. Miranda tried to send the eldest to an art studio, but Jacob, who had an undoubted talent for drawing, flatly refused to attend this institution and rushed to Jacob's room. He was already awake, sitting on the bed, grinning grimly, and seemed to be waiting for his parents. "Where is the money?" strictly asked the father, gently shook his son by the shoulders. "What kind?" Jacob, as always, pretended not to understand what he was accused of. But the boys gave off a cheerful sparkle in his dark eyes. He was clearly enjoying the situation. His parents' emotions were like chocolate candy to him. "The ones I put in the drawer. They're in vogue, and I plan to buy a car to take you all to the sea. That reminds me." Jacob owned the situation 100%. He got on his parents' nerves, got them emotional. That's a lot of mature behavior for a man 8 years old. "Where's the money?" Mason repeated his question. He tried to appear calm, But Miranda could see that the man was on the verge of a breakdown. Even his lips were beginning to sit up. No wonder. The spouse had been saving the necessary amount for so long, saving from his salary bonuses. He's been dreaming of a new car for a long time. You know, Daddy, the money burns and crunches so well. And the flavor is magical. I made a fire like this yesterday in the vacant lot. It's beautiful. Did you burn all the money? Mason is rapidly turning pale. No, not all of it. At first I bought myself 6 popsicles, but I threw half of them away. Mason turned silently and went into the bedroom. Miranda hurried after him. She could see that her husband was becoming unwell, physically ill. Her spouse walked swaying and suddenly settled to the floor, slid right down the wall, not wasting a second. Miranda dialed the ER phone. Mason was having a heart attack. The problem had been brewing for a long time, and the stress of the morning had triggered the attack. The paramedics got there just in time. They took him to the hospital, put him in the ICU. 24 hours. Miranda lived, flinching with every phone call, afraid it was from the hospital with sad news. James was there all the time, hugging and comforting. Even though he had tears in his eyes, he was very worried about his foster father, whom he loved sincerely and wholeheartedly. Jacob was in a good mood and continued to grate on his mother's and brother's nerves. For example, he asked questions about funerals and talked about the dangers of heart attacks. Miranda tried not to pay attention to the boy. Luckily, it all worked out. Mason pulled through. Doctors said that the man should be more careful to lead a healthy lifestyle. Take a lot of walks, if possible, avoid stress. But living with Jacob was one big stressor in itself. So Miranda made up her mind. She wasn't going to risk the health and happiness of her loved ones for a man who would never appreciate her efforts. Jacob will go back to the orphanage, and that's it. Of course, it's not an easy decision. After all, the boy has been in their family for 4 years. He has so much invested in him. Miranda is attached to the boy, but we can't drag it out any longer. First, the woman traveled to the orphanage alone. Mason was still in the hospital and got a meeting with the director. It was the same woman who had once talked to the spouses who were enthusiastic and determined to be happy foster parents. Yes, the situation is complicated, the woman summarized after listening to Miranda's long story. So the boy has a diagnosis after all. Poor kid. His childhood with an alcoholic mother did not pass without trauma. Maybe it's not the trauma. James grew up in the same family. But he's a perfectly normal kid, friendly, helpful. With his own problems, of course, but nothing like Jacob. The eldest is a monster. He made our whole family's life a living hell. Of course, you have the right to return Jacob to our facility, especially since he has a diagnosis that you didn't know about when you adopted him. The poor kid's been through so much, and he's back in an institution. Miranda suddenly realized she was being manipulated. The director's clearly trying to appeal to pity, appealing to her conscience. But no, she's not going to get away with it. James went through the same thing. But he's a normal kid. It's some kind of congenital abnormality. Didn't you examine the kid before you offered him up for adoption? Not everyone's ready to raise a sick kid. So yeah, it's not congenital, it's just Jacob. He saw it all. He watched his mother die before his eyes at the hands of a lunging roommate. Hence the problems. Miranda was stunned. It was scary to imagine such a thing. She had long felt nothing but disgust, mixed with fear for Jacob. But now suddenly she felt insanely sorry for the boy. Only it didn't matter anyway. Jacob didn't belong in their family. She had tried. She had fought for 4 whole years to get her eldest son to behave normally. But it's all in vain. His behavior is becoming increasingly dangerous. He clearly needed a special professional approach. Miranda tried to put the day they returned Jacob to the orphanage out of her mind, but it didn't work. The boy realized he wasn't being taken for another checkup. About halfway down the road, he recognized the road, though he had last traveled it as a child. The boy threw a tantrum right in the car. He shrieked at his feet, beat his whole body, insulted his foster parents with words that normally an 8-year-old should not know, promised revenge, vicious revenge, tried to stop Mason from driving. But Miranda was ready for something like that. She held the desperately resisting boy tightly. Tears were rolling down her cheeks. Only the woman didn't see them. She was hurt, bitter. She felt like the last person, a traitor, an irresponsible cuckoo. And at the same time, she realized that there was no other way. Jacob wasn't freaking out because he was breaking up with the people he loved, his foster parents, and his brother. No, this kid had no sense of attachment. Miranda had seen that in the years she'd lived with Jacob. The boy was terrified of losing all the goodies he had, his own room, fancy clothes, gadgets, traveling, yummy toys. Of course, and I didn't feel sorry for Jacob, but it's very dangerous to keep him in the family. Not only for the family, but for the people around him. Jacob was clearly becoming more aggressive and cynical. Medication doesn't help much. He needs special care and supervision. Afterwards, Miranda never once regretted his action. Yes, at first it was hard for her and her husband. They even moved. I was tired of keeping silent in response to the neighbor's question about where the other boy had gone. And to tell the truth did not turn the tongue. And a whole different life began for the family. Calm, happy, measured. Was it only thoughts of Jacob that marred that happiness? Miranda couldn't forget about him, couldn't stop thinking about that child. Sometimes she even looked at his profile. The boy was again proposed for adoption, but now he had a different health group. There was a serious diagnosis in his file. The years flew by. James became an adult. He graduated from school with a silver medal, then with a red diploma. He served in the army. He got a job, became an engineer at the local thermal power plant. Miranda and Mason could not be pleased with their son successful, handsome, intelligent, responsive. He was very attentive to his parents. Although he already lived separately, he often came to visit his elders and always not empty-handed. He didn't even need to be asked for help. James could sense when his mother and father needed him and would show up at the right moment. Miranda loved the evenings when her son would stop by for a cup of tea after work. They would sit and talk about everything and nothing. It was very, very pleasant. True, there was a heavy price to pay for happiness. But that's in the past. Now everything's all right. They deserved to be happy. And then James got married. His wife Lisa became his daughter, not Mason's. He and his daughter-in-law developed a surprisingly warm and trusting relationship. Now the traditional evening gatherings became even more fun and heartwarming. When Mason died suddenly of a heart attack, it was Lisa and James who pulled Miranda out of the darkness. Her husband's heart had been flooding from his youth, but still the woman hoped to face old age with her spouse. The children were there for her in her time of need. Looking at the couple, Miranda couldn't imagine what would happen to her now without James. What a blessing that once she and her husband decided to take a child from an orphanage, finally get out of a difficult condition. The woman was helped by the news that she would soon become a grandmother. Of course, it hurt that Mason didn't get to have a grandchild. He would have been a wonderful grandfather. Still, life had taken on new bright colors. An ultrasound revealed that the newlyweds were having twins, and a royal one at that, a boy and a girl. The due date was approaching. Miranda was visiting local baby stores in anticipation of the joyous event. Her closet already had an entire section filled with cute little things. For babies, these clothes would be enough for twins up to 3 years old. And then another stroke of fate. As if they hadn't had enough in their lives, James and Lisa were in a car accident. The son was badly hurt. They took him to the emergency room. Lisa had less serious injuries, but the impact was on her stomach and the babies. All in all, they were not saved. Miranda blamed herself for everything, thinking it was fate that was punishing her so cruelly. For getting rid of Jacob then, for not passing the test. Forensics showed that someone had deliberately disabled the braking system in James's car. An investigation was launched. Various theories were tested. The most likely one was that James' business competitors were suspected of the crime. Shortly before the accident, he opened his own business, and his business was going uphill, which did not suit everyone. James was rescued. He was now in a regular room and needed to stay in the hospital for at least another month. He would need several operations to recover. But Lisa was discharged quite quickly. Poor girl could not live in their apartment with James, where everything reminded of the loss. They had already prepared a nursery for the babies. Lisa went to her parents in the country. She needed a change of scenery. Miranda understood her daughter-in-law. Her heart bled every time she looked at the things she had prepared for her grandson and granddaughter. What to say about Lisa, who had lost her children at such a great age? Fortunately, nothing more threatened James' life. Although, of course, he still has a lot of healing to do. Miranda was very disturbed by the fact that the whole thing was set up. If it had been an accident, that's different. But someone intentionally messed up the brakes on the car. The investigation, of course, was underway, but for some reason Miranda did not particularly believe that the criminals would be found. James himself had no idea who had done it. He didn't even have a clue. It wasn't on a cozy February evening. Miranda was coming home from the hospital. From his son, James looked so lost, so depressed. He was taking the loss of his children very hard. And Lisa's condition was very troubling to him. The entryway was dark for some reason. It was as if all the light bulbs on the floors had suddenly burned out. That's strange. It had never happened before. The elevator wasn't working either. Must be another glitch. The lights are out. Miranda went up to the 7th floor, a little out of breath. What could she do? She's not a girl anymore. She opened the door with her key and suddenly felt a hard push in the back. The woman fell to the floor of her dark hallway, and someone almost invisible in the dusk was already locking the door from the inside. A chilling wave of fear rolled over her. She was close to panic at her apartment intruder. He's close by, and there's nowhere to wait for help. Blood led to the head. Her face became hot, and her hands and feet, on the contrary, suddenly turned into a haze. She tried to see in the darkness of the man who pushed her into the apartment, but only his silhouette stood out in the evening twilight. It was a man, tall, thin. But why is he here? What does he even want? The stranger flicked a switch and a warm light flooded the hallway. So the lights weren't out after all. And then Miranda finally looked at the named guest and recognized him. She recognized him, even though it had been almost 20 years since she had last seen him. Without a doubt, it was Jacob. The boy she'd once returned to the orphanage had grown up too. The same prickly look in his dark eyes, the same evil smirk on his lips. And that's when Miranda became even more afraid. She realized that it was unlikely Jacob had dropped by to see the woman who had been his foster mom for 4 whole years. He had come for revenge, as he had promised then on the way to the orphanage. "Hello, Mommy," finally broke the silence uninvited guest. His voice sounded quite friendly, even somehow soothing. Almost gently, Miranda got up from the floor and boldly looked into the eyes of her former foster son. "What does that mean? What do you think you're doing?" "I'm going to call the police now." "And that's unlikely." Jacob smiled. With a deft movement of his hand, he snatched the purse from Miranda's shoulder and shook its contents right onto the floor. The cell phone hit the tile with a thud. The man picked it up, twirled it around in his hands, and then it burst with a thud. The glass shards spattered in all directions. Miranda clamped her hand over her mouth. Sharp movements, impulsive actions. If before this scene it was still possible to hope for a favorable outcome of the meeting, then now Jacob's intentions were certainly not to be doubted. "You don't want to know how I've lived all this time while you, Daddy, and James have enjoyed traveling, socializing, outings, and holidays. I realize it's been hard on you, but I tried. I honestly tried to reach out to you. Only you did everything to spite me. The more I praised you, the more I paid attention to you, the more you crossed the line. Eventually, it just became dangerous to be around you. So you just got rid of me like damaged goods at the store." Not just on Miranda, suddenly on the swing of memory. She experienced again the bitterness and despair of those days. We tried to treat you. Remember, you refused. You were angry with us. It just kept getting worse and worse. Believe me, it wasn't an easy decision to make, and it's been hard for me all these years to realize what happened. It's hard for you." Jacob's lips played that evil smirk again, and his gaze became hard and icy. "What do you know about what's hard? You want me to tell you more about it." Jacob. What Jacob is, it's scary to hear the truth. So in the orphanage I was bad, very bad. I was humiliated, insulted, tied to my bed at night, beaten, made to clean up after the other kids. I scrubbed toilets, changed stinky diapers. Baby, it all made me very angry, and I got revenge. Revenge on them, on all of them. And Jacob started his story. He hated the caregivers. He hated everything about them. The hypocrisy, the cruelty, the indifference, even their appearance. In his mind, the boy did terrible things to them. But in real life, he lacked strength. But little Jacob could do small deeds. Took money from purses, staff, packs, adults' clothes, smelling ointment, tearing up reports and other documents. Of course, they caught him, punished him severely, left him without dinner, locked him in the basement all night, beating him and flooding him with more of this. It was their mistake. The adults thought they would make Jacob afraid, achieve his obedience by intimidation, but anger only empowered the boy. His head was filled with new plans, which he did not hesitate to realize. Jacob tried to treat, gave him some pills that made him confused, and he wanted to sleep all the time. The guy felt that he was getting dumber from these drugs, so he learned to hold them under his tongue and then spit them out. His behavior was getting worse. Getting into a new family was out of the question. First of all, he was old enough. Adoptive parents prefer kids under 5. In the second place, the diagnosis, which hinged on him past adoptive parents, a lifelong stigma. Anyway, after some time, Jacob was transferred to a specialized boarding school for children with mental disabilities. His mind solving problems for high school students. The boy was forced to be around mentally challenged teenagers all the time. It was quite an ordeal. True, the boy managed to intimidate the other pupils to such an extent that they all tried to stay away from him, even the strongest and most aggressive ones. It wasn't hard. Jacob always knew how to find the weaknesses of those around him. All this time, the boy imagined how his brother was living without him, probably bathed in the attention and love of foster parents. Those buy him beautiful clothes, gadgets, bicycles, and scooter, take him to the sea. They organize these birthday parties for the fairy. He's rolling around like a cheese in butter. And Jacob has to rot alive in such a horrible place. It's not fair. How he wanted to go home for revenge. Not Mason. And James, too, of course. For their betrayal, for their hearty, quiet lives, for all their joys. Before going to bed, Jacob liked to dream of meeting his foster parents. That sooner or later it would happen, the boy did not doubt. They will answer for everything. They will regret that they treated him so badly. Each time in his thoughts, Jacob dealt with a happy family. In different ways. I can't wait for this moment to come. For now, while the boy was still too young and weak to do anything about it, he would have to put up with modern inconveniences, but then everything would change. Jacob prepared himself, read the staff left behind, and newspapers and books, watched television. He needed to stay informed about what was going on in the world, so that later, having found freedom, not to be confused on the street, but to act clearly and organized. And the boy also practiced sports, doing push-ups, pull-ups on the bar, lifting dumbbells. Of course, the boarding school regularly held LFK classes, but it was not enough to stay strong, and Jacob could not afford to be weak. He had a goal, for which he steadfastly overcame all difficulties. Running away from the boarding school was not an option. The institution was far outside the city limits and was surrounded by a high fence with barbed wire. But after 18 years, Jacob was transferred to an adult institution. The regime there was less strict. Here, the guy decided to prove himself on the good side. He liked to take people out. He literally fed off their negative emotions. But for the sake of the greater goal, I had to pull myself together and starve a little. Jacob knew how to appear adequate. When he became the perfect patient and best assistant to the staff, he'd move a cabinet so the cleaning lady could wipe the dust underneath it. He'd help a nurse carry a heavy tray of medication to the post. The boy never ceased to be amazed at how easy it was to hoodwink and manipulate others. Soon he became everyone's favorite. People smiled and complimented him. They marveled at his kindness and helpfulness. Jacob Delano was embarrassed, and he mentally insulted them, spit in their faces, beat them up. No one had any idea what was going on in his head. And if they did, they'd probably run as far away as they could in a panic, wouldn't they? 10 years went by like that. Jacob was gaining strength, coming up with the details of the plan. It was pleasant to think that the moment of meeting with the traders was getting closer and closer. Jacob's control weakened so much that he was even entrusted to meet at the gate a car carrying clean linen from the laundry. Jacob's duties included taking away and locking the gate. Jacob took on his new position in October and realized this was his chance to break free. He just needs to wait for summer so he can get out in warmer weather. It's easier that way. Soon the foster parents and James, the trader, would get their fill. The thought even took his breath away. Nothing pleased Jacob as much as the imminent meeting with a happy, prosperous family. They'd all be surprised. The man counted down the days to summer. His impatience was growing. A long-forgotten feeling, rage, anger, resentment surged back into his soul. And then he happened to see a report on TV about James's brother, a talented engineer who had recently started his own business. In the interview, the successful, handsome man willingly shared his experience, and Jacob was moved. He decided to quit the very next day, even though it was January. He couldn't wait any longer. They shouldn't live happily ever after. Just a few more extra months. No more. It was time to pay the price. During the night, the man in the balloon at the staff bag pockets also got into the cash register. He knew the code to the safe a long time ago. It was a good sum for an expensive meal. Sure enough, he had warm clothes. The state provided patients with coats, felt boots, mittens, and flowers, so there were no obstacles in his way. And so, having let the car out of the laundry in the morning, as usual, the man slipped out of the gate without anyone noticing. Here it is, the long-awaited freedom. To the city of 5 kilometers we'll reach in an hour at a brisk pace. Underfoot crunching snow on the heart sang. Nightingales' light frost cheered up. From the sky, the sun shone brightly. Happy Jacob was on his way back to the town where his foster parents and sibling lived. The thought that they were unaware of the approaching trouble warmed his soul. They would soon answer for their evil deeds and get what they deserved. But I don't understand. Jacob, Miranda interrupted. After all, when you and James were very small, we tried very hard to take care of you, bought sweets and toys, paid attention to you. Why? Why did you behave so badly? Like you were getting back at me for something. Jacob replied. For not loving you, for not caring, for not being my real mom. She loved me, said I was just like her. She made me really happy. She needed me, you know. And the rest of us are shallow. Jacob was the fifth wheel in the cart, the ballast I wanted to get rid of. I've often compared the way you looked at me, at him with love and tenderness, she me with squeamishness. Miranda thought for a moment. There was nothing to object to. She tried. She tried hard not to show Jacob her attitude, but he's just a little kid. Everyone still thinks your mom's a po. That bastard killed her. I saw the whole thing. And when I was 4 years old, I swore I'd get revenge on him. It was the first thing I looked for when I ran away from the hospital. And I found it. But it was too late. That one was already long dead himself. But next on my list was you. Jacob went to the train station first thing, joined the local homeless. He could always find a way to get along with anyone if he wanted to, of course. There was money for food, cigarettes, and booze. The man treated his new friends generously. He made them his agents. Now, every day there were station wardens and beggars searching the city, looking for Miranda Mason James. After a couple weeks, the search yielded a welcome result. One of the homeless men had discovered where Miranda lived. "That's it. You moved. But I still found you. Even if you had left town or the country, I would have come for you sooner or later. Too bad Mason didn't catch me coming back. It would have been even more interesting that way." Jacob began to keep an eye on his foster mother's house. His vantage point was an abandoned building nearby. They were going to build a store there, but they abandoned it. So the building stood in the middle of the yard, gradually destroyed and hung up, a convenient place to play hide and seek. Jacob studied Miranda's schedule. Now he knew when she usually went to the store and walked the dog. James often drove to his mother's house in his beautiful car. Jacob knew that such foreign cars are not cheap, which means that things are going well. Moreover, his wife was expecting a child. Beautiful, so smiling Jacob family happiness does not shine. By and large, he does not need it. But the thought of his brother's well-being did not give the man peace. Miranda realized what Jacob was about to say. She clamped her hands over her mouth and looked at him with furious eyes. Her premonition had not failed her after all. What had happened to James and Lisa was really connected to what she and Mason had done 20 years ago. "I see you guessed it." The man smiled contentedly. Yes, of course I did. I did a little digging under the hood of my brother's car while he and his wife were visiting you. And then bam, and it was an unfortunate accident. I was hoping for more, but James survived. Except he's not gonna have kids anymore. It's a small thing, but it's nice. I hate you." Miranda was ready to lunge at Jacob, once scratching his satisfied face, kicking the bastard with her feet. "That's news to me," carelessly shrugged the monster in human form. "I knew you hated me. I've known since I was a little kid. And it's mutual, by the way." "He didn't do anything to you," Miranda screamed. "I realize we're adults. Maybe we're to blame for you not having the patience to go through the ordeal of your illness. But this has nothing to do with James. He didn't even try to stop you, and he was probably relieved when you gave me up. And then he enjoyed all those benefits that were supposedly meant for both of us alone, enjoyed your wealthy, close-knit family. I don't think he was worried about his older brother. It was time to pay the bills. That's all there is to it. It's only fair. And by the way, of course, I'll finish what I started. It's not that hard to get into the hospital where James is. And I know where he is. Hospital, ward, room number. But I'm gonna deal with you first. You're a monster." Miranda sighed tiredly. "You always have been. I could feel it as soon as I saw you looking at me. I should have listened to my intuition. But you wanted to feel like a mom so badly. You were so afraid of your own inferiority that you decided to take on a beast in addition to a cute little fairy baby. More days must make a human out of a petty scumbag to feel kinder, nobler afterward." Miranda silent. Jacob again partially guessed her thoughts. How clever and perceptive was he? He could be a talented psychologist, help people. "Well, we've talked about everything," Jacob summarized. He slowly began to approach the woman. The woman instinctively floated backwards. This continued until Miranda's back was against the wall. That was it. There was no further retreat. I tried to be a loving mother to you, but you always screwed it up," she whispered, looking into Jacob's smiling face. "Why does he smile all the time? Were you an adult? I'm a little kid. It's the fault of the one who is older and more experienced. So, Mommy, don't try to pin this on me. That's pretty low, even for you. What are you gonna do to me? I have so many options, I don't even know what to choose. I've had plenty of time to think about it." Miranda made a desperate attempt to slip behind Jacob, but he easily intercepted her and put his hands behind her back. The pain made the woman bend in half. She could feel that Jacob had become strong, very strong. He was no longer the little boy who could be spanked on the soft spot and sent to the corner. Now let's take a walk to my car. How are we doing? I rented it from one of your neighbors. Did you know some people don't even lock their schools? Their brains think nobody wants a rusty thing like that. But what do we care what we drive? Don't we? Jacob, continuing to keep Miranda's hands behind her back, pushed her out into the entryway. It was still dark in there. I screwed out the light bulbs on all the floors, Jacob bragged. I'd made sure that I wouldn't get caught on camera, and that no one would notice us on the way out. And most importantly, so you wouldn't see me. I was standing right next to your door when you opened it. As soon as she didn't feel it, Miranda tried to twist away and cried out from the pain that struck her shoulder blades. Jacob took it in his own way. Don't you dare scream for help. If you do, you'll just wring your neck and go for physics. Miranda realized that Jacob was not joking. He is really capable of that, and God knows what else. That's why she reached her neighbor's rusty old Jiguli silently, without resisting. Only prayed to herself that someone would meet them on the way. But there was no miracle. Jacob pushed the foster mother in the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel. Do you have a license? Miranda wondered. No, of course not. They don't give licenses to people like me. It's my first time driving. But I know what's what in theory. It's no big deal. I've done a lot of preparation for this meeting, so I've got it under control. Jacob didn't get going the first time, but after that, it was perfect. It was hard to believe that it was his first time driving, despite the horror of the situation. Miranda was once again amazed at how quickly Jacob grasped everything. I wondered where he was taking her now. And most importantly, what to do now. How to warn Fyodor about the danger if something happened to him. Miranda won't survive that. Although, judging by Jacob's attitude, she won't even know about it. The car drove out of town. Snow-covered fields and forests flashed outside the windows. Miranda began to shiver. She was not dressed for the weather. Her down jacket had been left at home. On her feet, instead of boots, were ordinary slippers. During the conversation with her eldest son, the woman took off her warm clothes. And when Jacob dragged the reception, the mother did not have time to dress outside, but it was almost hot in the salon. I guess shivering is a manifestation of stress after all. Where are we going? Miranda asked. Jacob silently stared at the road with a concentrated and sidelong glance. It was the same way he sometimes did. As a child, it was the look of a deeply ill man, his diagnosis coupled with his high intelligence and lack of moral principles. Scary, heavy, not a pleasant person, causing disgust and dislike. He is simply impossible to love. And it was not hard to believe what Jacob said about his own mother. Allegedly, he was her favorite. But now something has to be done. Something has to be done to save James. There's got to be a way out. I'm sorry, Miranda suddenly blurted out. The phrase brought Jacob out of his daze. He turned to the woman with surprise, looked carefully into her eyes, and sighed heavily. I see you're trying to placate me, but in fact you don't feel guilty at all. You don't, do you? I'm sorry for being scared then, for betraying me. It's no use. Jacob shook his head. You'll all get what you deserve today. And then Miranda wondered, what will happen then? Where will you go? What will you do? Jacob's face suddenly contorted out of anger. The woman realized that she had hit his sore spot. It seems that the elder Nicky hasn't thought about the future yet, or is very afraid of it. He won't be now. I'm not gonna be, James. You won't be happy for a while. You won't even have anyone to share your triumph with. No one will know how good you are. No one will appreciate the genius of your plan. No one will ever know. Jacob looked a little confused. Miranda understood. It was now or never. There was a small chance of salvation. Let me go, suddenly she begged. Let me go, please. No, muffled, Jacob answered. Now he looked resolved, as if he were thinking somewhere very far away. Let me go, let me go, let me go. But suddenly, it was like it was stuck. She said the phrase over and over like a mantra, like an incantation. Jacob suddenly stopped the car abruptly on a deserted highway, with snow-covered forests stretching on both sides of the road. The first stars were already shining in the sky. Miranda looked the man straight in the face. Now it was the same old Jacob, grinning, collected, organized detachment and confusion. As gone as ever. Obviously, he had finally made a decision. "Well said, Jacob. Okay, you got it. I'm letting you go." Before Miranda realized what she had heard, the man opened the door and pushed her right out into the snow. For the second time that evening, she fell, hurt her knees. The February frost immediately burned open areas, bodies, legs, arms, neck, and Jacob turned abruptly and rushed in the opposite direction back to town, probably to the hospital, to James. The frost was getting worse. Miranda understood perfectly well that she would not last long, and all around was an empty road, fields, and forest. The woman could barely feel the tips of her toes. The wind had picked up too. Miranda rushed towards the nearest forest. First of all, the movement would keep her warm. Secondly, she was really hoping to take shelter behind the trees from the piercing icy wind. And third, Miranda was afraid Jacob would change his mind and come back for her. Better to freeze in the winter woods than to fall back into the hands of this monster who had been hatching elaborate plans of revenge for years. But it wasn't much better in the thick of it. The frost was physically painful, and then suddenly it was easier, even warmer. The snowdrift beneath the thick fur seemed a soft change to the woman. She sank right into it and felt no cold. How pleasantly, how gently the immense fatigue came on. Her eyes were closing on their own. Miranda realized that it was necessary to hold on. Sleep was not an option, but there was no strength left to resist this tenderness. Miranda was pulled out of sleep by someone's strong arms. It was Charles, as he carried her wrapped in a down jacket that was missing strong cigarettes. She thought she was dreaming about the man, but in the warmth of the gatehouse, she pulled away. She pulled herself together. She regained her ability to think clearly. The first thing the woman did was call the police, both here and the hospital, just as long as they got here in time. Just so Jacob wouldn't have time to get to the unsuspecting James. Charles listened to his overnight guest without interrupting. With each word, he became more and more convinced that he had done the right thing by choosing the life of a hermit. People are complicated, strange, incomprehensible. Who's to blame for this story? Jacob, who endured so much horror and hardship as a child. Miranda, not coping with the upbringing of a difficult child, or maybe the administration of the orphanage, hiding from adopters, the past of the pupils, and unwilling to seek an approach to the underprivileged and children. Charles is very tired of communicating with this woman. Her story shook the man to his core. He wouldn't have wanted to hear it all. And now Charles knew for sure. He would replay the hard stories over and over in his head and relive them. There's no telling how it will end here. What if he's looking for me? Miranda was worried. Maybe he came back for me, stumbled across my footprints, and then yours. "I have a gun," answered the woodsman. But then he remembered that he had left it near the bathhouse. The man stood up and headed for the door. Miranda clung to him with a dead grip. "Where are you going? Wait. Don't open the door. You don't know him. He could be lurking out there under the window, waiting. He'll do anything. It's a monster, a beast, a monster from hell." The man didn't argue. Miranda was clearly not herself right now. No reason to make her more nervous than she already was. And then there was a knock on the door. Quiet, even delicate. The woman flinched. There's a look of horror in her eyes. She turned pale, literally pale. Charles was afraid. Was she having a heart attack? There was another knock at the door. Miranda silently rolled to the far corner. Charles felt the icy hand of fear clutching his heart for the first time in years. Who was now standing on his old lady's doorstep? Could it be the police who were just about to arrive? Or the revenge-hungry Jacob? The courage to ask the simple question of whose there was somehow lacking. "Open the police," a confident male voice finally sounded. Charles and Miranda looked at each other. The fear had not yet receded. Who knows, It might be Jacob trying to lure them outside. But then a second voice joined in, announcing the rank and name. There was no doubt left outside the door. Really, police officers. Charles swung the door open. 4 uniformed men entered the house. You found Jacob, grabbed him. Miranda pounced on the intruders with questions. She sounded desperate. No, the oldest of the group shook his head negatively. But we've put out an APB and sent a unit to the hospital. You're all right. You're not hurt. Do you need medical attention? No, Miranda exclaimed. She began to shiver again. Charles saw how fear for her son made the woman's voice break and her whole body shudder. He threw the plate over Miranda's shoulders. Maybe that would help her shiver a little. In that case, you need to come with us to the station. Sign some papers, give a statement. And you too, man. Are you a witness? I didn't see anything. I just found her in the woods, the forester explained. Let's go through, repeated the policeman. All right, the man shrugged. He had no idea how he could help the investigation. But if he had to, where could he go? And another thing, Charles realized that Miranda needed his presence. She was close to hysteria. She needed someone to be there for her. She needed support. While waiting for the police, they'd sort of bonded. The woman told him her whole life story, a very complicated story. At the police station, they were taken to different rooms. Charles was asked questions. They asked him the smallest details about the moment when he found Miranda in the forest. He answered calmly. Then they let him sign the report and let him go. In the hallway, on a couch against a shabby wall, Miranda sat pale, lonely, confused. She tightly grabbed herself with her hands around her shoulders and slowly rocked forward back and forth from side to side in a daze. She was brought out by Charles' question. Are you all right? Miranda looked at him with a cloudy look and shook her head negatively. No, I'm far from all right. I've never been so scared or so heavy. A monster is destroying my life. They let you go already? Yeah. They asked me a bunch of questions, signed my name, and told me to go home. They're kind of putting a guard on the building. In case Jacob shows up and I can't go in there. You know, there's no way I'm gonna be able to step foot in my own apartment until he's behind bars. I'm gonna see him everywhere. Charles realized it could not be left alone right now and was surprised that the police did not give her an escort. Letting a woman go home in that condition at a time when the man who threatened her life. Not caught. I'll stay with you, decisively, the man declares. Sits down next to me. Thank you. You saved my life and you're helping me. Okay. I don't know what I would have done without you. Miranda looked at Charles with gratitude. It made him feel much stronger and even younger. How is something in the hospital? Lesnick inquired to hide his embarrassment. Jacob got there. The problem is, they didn't tell me anything. The woman's voice rang out. She was close to hysteria again. They say the mystery of the investigation, and that I'll know everything when the time comes. But we can go there ourselves. Charles suggested it. If you don't want to go home. A faint smile flashed across Miranda's face, for perhaps the first time in ages. Yeah, I'll have them call us a cab. I've got money in my pocket. Good thing I didn't have time to cash it out. Half an hour later, the cab brought Miranda Charles to the hospital building where James was lying. Several police cars were parked outside the gate, flashing lights off. No people in the passenger compartment. Everything seemed very quiet and peaceful. Charles and Miranda stepped inside the spacious lobby, blinding them with bright light. It was almost empty. Only in the corner a man and a woman were sitting on a chair. Apparently, they were waiting for their turn to see the doctor on duty. What can I do for you? The receptionist, a young girl, addressed them with a smile. Charles noticed that she was agitated, although she was trying to keep a semblance of calm. Something must have happened here. The man decided not to walk around. Yes, about decisively went to this smiling girl in a white coat and asked directly, "What was your recent mess here?" "What?" The receptionist was surprised, and then added, "How do you know?" This woman here is the mother of a patient who seems to be in danger. She has a right to know what's going on. I can show you my credentials if you need me to. Miranda's on. Tell me my James is okay." The desperation and pleading in the woman's eyes did the trick. The receptionist girl and told our visitors everything she knew about the situation. Yes, indeed, an intruder had broken into the hospital. In a ward on the 3rd floor, a fight broke out. An alarm was sounded. Other patients in the ward were evacuated. It seems that 2 patients and the perpetrator barricaded themselves in the room. It was clear something terrible was going on in there. Then the police arrived, a whole bunch of them. The squad stormed the ward, and one of the participants was led in handcuffs with his head down past the receptionist's desk. And another, the second participant in the incident, was rumored to be undergoing surgery right now, and his life hung in the balance. "Sidenko," exclaimed the woman, grabbing life by the heart, "when I can see him. And that's only after the operation, if the doctor allows it. Sit here for the time being. As soon as he's free, I'll call you." Doctors are obliged to inform relatives of their patient's condition. The wait lasted about an hour. During that time, Miranda didn't say a word. The woman turned into a pale statue with full. Charles' eyes were hard to look at her, but he couldn't leave Miranda now in such a state either, not anymore. Besides, he was already very curious. How would this unusual story end? Lesnica hoped that everything would be fine with James. "The doctor is in his office. He is ready to perceive," finally informed the girl administrator. Her whole look expressed sympathy for Miranda. "Come with me, please," the woman asked pleadingly, looking at the forester. Of course he went. What else was there for him to do? In a matter of hours, Miranda's fate had become dear to him. "So was your son hurt?" "Of course," the doctor said. "He took a blow to the head. Severe fracture to the skull. Lucky guy. Couple more millimeters and he'd be dead. Or a vegetable at best. He'll live a full life. You can breathe. And him? Is he awake?" "Yes, he's in the intensive care unit right now. There's a police officer sitting by the door. I can let you in for a few minutes. Just the next of kin." "There's 2 of us," Miranda said hurriedly, clinging to Charles' arm. He didn't object. He realized that the woman was afraid to be without his support even for a minute. There was indeed a policeman at the door of the room. Charles thought he was guarding James from Jacob, who might return. True, the girl said that he was taken away in handcuffs. That guard is probably just a formality. Jacob is in the hands of the police. James and Miranda are no longer in danger. Entering the room and looking at the young man with the renamed head, Miranda awed and began to slowly slump on the floor. Horror froze in her eyes. This was not a reaction the forester was prepared for. "What is it?" Charles held her up under his arms. "Yes, the boy doesn't look well. But the doctor said James is going to be fine." "It's not James," Miranda exclaimed. It was Jacob. Charles staring in amazement at the man under the thin hospital sheet, pale with black eyes. Sharp facial features, black, attentive eyes, and a very unpleasant smile on his face. "Where's James?" Miranda rushed over to him. "What's going on?" "I don't know. In jail, I guess, where he belongs. I'm in the hospital. He's in jail. You once had 2 monsters at once. What a coincidence. James was just better at pretending all along. But he's more dangerous than me." "How much more dangerous?" "I'm a long way from him." Miranda threw herself at Jacob. Charles struggled to pull her to the far corner. He marveled at the strength of this frail-looking woman who had been through so much that night. "Now listen to the truth, Monty. The unpleasant truth." Miranda nodded her head, signaling that she was ready to listen to the tube-wrapped and machine-connected man. Her tormentor looked helpless and safe now. And Jacob told Charles Miranda listened to the man without interrupting. Jacob told that most of the marriages for which he had been scolded as a child had been James' doing. The boy, despite his very young age, masterfully set up his brother. He was the one who painted the wallpaper after the renovation. He mutilated the cat. He beat dishes, spoiled things, and encouraged the unstable elder to do bad things. He lied, he bullied, he coaxed. Jacob's disease progressed thanks in large part to James, who squeezed the most out of his brother's condition. He did whatever he wanted, covering up for his brother, manipulating the older man, taking pleasure in it, and thereby contributed in every possible way to the unraveling of Jacob's already fragile mental health. When Jacob grew up and began to understand something, he tried to get through to his parents, telling them the antics of clever and calculating younger brother. But no one had confidence in the older man anymore. James. Everyone's James is simple. Remember when we were about 7 or 8 years old? Tragedy struck. We were walking on a construction site, and one of my classmates fell from a height and crashed. You were still yelling at me at the time. I was accused of walking in such dangerous places was definitely my idea, and that I was the one who put them all in danger. And Benjamin died partly because of me too. Miranda nodded. She remembered that moment well. It had seemed to her then that Jacob's deviant behavior had threatened James' life and health. The woman imagined with horror that in the place of the dead boy could be her beloved son, and all because of the delusions of the elder, probably, at that time, and the idea of giving Jacob to an orphanage was born in her head. Now it was James who suggested that Benjamin go to the other side of the beam. There it was 5-6 stories high, roughly, and concrete blocks with rebar sticking out at the bottom. No chance. When the boy refused, just pushed him and Benjamin flew down. No. Horrified, Miranda exclaimed. It can't be. I don't believe you. He flew down, Jacob continued, and James looked up and smiled. You don't know him like that, but I know very well. I was afraid of him myself then, and I'm afraid of him today too. And for good reason. I mean, he's been weak since the surgery, and he made my head fall apart. We barely got James back together. He's capable of much more than that. You don't know him at all. And then Jacob told me something even worse. Running away from the hospital, he followed James for a while and found his lair. Yeah, James had his own lair. A small box in the garage of our cooperative, and the beaten soundproofing Miranda materials there he kept someone. Jacob never realized who. James periodically came to the garage with bags from the supermarket and then took out garbage, scraps, some rags at the moment when the door was opened. Sometimes screams would be heard, but then they'd stop. As soon as the door slammed shut, I tried to figure out who was sitting there, who he was keeping in there, but everything inside was blocked with some kind of soundproofing sleepy stuff. He's always calculated everything with amazing precision. Ever since he was a little boy. That's not true. That's not true. A sobbing howl in a corner. Miranda shut up now, and Charles already knew Jacob wasn't lying. He could see it in his eyes, and there were cops on duty at the door. He's not here to guard the patient. He's there to keep a dangerous patient from escaping. After all, Jacob, though hurt, is a criminal, just like his brother James, not the dreamer of a once-forgotten love. Abandoned children do indeed get two monsters. James turned out to be insane. A virtuoso at hiding a decent family man as a successful man. The high intelligence he possessed from birth allowed him to pretend to lead a double life. A model boy and a bully. A successful man and a skillful manipulator of the perfect stage. A cruel man. James liked to live like that and be one thing. To choose a single identity seemed silly and boring to him. He kept people in his bunker, mostly young girls, and when they died, he disposed of the bodies and looked for new victims. This went on for years. He had several ruined lives to his credit, and there's no telling how many more people he would have killed if it hadn't been for Jacob. Before going to the operation, the older brother managed to give the police details of James' life. He was detained pending further investigation, and they found out things that would make the most seasoned of people's heads spin. Miranda never made it back to her apartment. She had to stay in the hospital for a while. She couldn't take the blow of fate. Charles visited her. She seemed genuinely pleased by his visits, and before she was discharged, she asked him to stay at his cabin for a while, away from people, from their judgment and questioning. The man perfectly understood this desire to hide from everyone and everything from the cruel reality. So now they lived together, trying not to remember what had happened and not to think about the future, taking care of each other only sometimes at night. Miranda was awakened by her own screaming. She was plagued by nightmares. True, less and less often. Charles was sure that the forest and nature would do its work, would heal dear Miranda.
Subscribe and click the bell.
Adriana was once again admiring the sunset, sitting on the shore of the lake. She had her brushes in her hands and her easel next to her. Spending time painting, she lost track of time, completely immersed in her occupation. Drawing? Love. From her earliest childhood, she always tried to transfer to paper everything she liked, or vice versa. All her thoughts and experiences, and she was also very fond of nature. No detail escapes her attentive eye. She depicted the smallest strokes with remarkable precision. Adriana's mother could always understand what mood her daughter was in. After all, her paintings and drawings spoke more eloquently than any words. One glance was enough to tell. Memories of her mother, who had left the world so early, hurt her heart. Adriana had been very close to her mother. She seemed to her the epitome of femininity and beauty. After all, there was simply no other way to think of her. She seemed to warm everyone around her with her radiant smile, and it was impossible not to fall in love with her kind eyes. Adriana idolized her mother, as well as her father, although he had a completely different personality. Father loved Adriana's mom madly. They had traveled a very difficult path together, which led them to wealth. But unfortunately, to continue to go through life, he now had to go it alone. Mom died suddenly and quickly. She just didn't wake up one day. It turned out that she had suffered from a heart defect since childhood, but stubbornly hid it from everyone. It was her style not to bother or worry her loved ones. Therefore, no one even suspected of the disease. Adriana still remembered that terrible day when her mother was gone, how her father screamed when he found his wife dead. The girl had crammed herself into a closet out of fear and didn't come out of there until the evening. The realization that in her life will never be a mother again came much later, when she and her father had to adjust their lives together. The relationship with her father was much more complicated, though Adriana respected and obeyed him immensely. But her father was harsh, categorical, and demanding. He did not approve of his daughter's choice of profession, so he forced her to leave art school and high school and to prepare for a serious university in a useful, as he said, specialty. Adriana realized that her father did it out of good intentions. After all, he repeatedly said that he would leave all his fortune to her, and she, in turn, should properly dispose of it. But the girl was far away from all this, thinking and dreaming of something else entirely. Of course, she was accustomed to the comfortable conditions in which she lived, but all this seemed to her secondary, not requiring to sacrifice her dreams. The sunset today was unusual, crimson, maroon from the brilliance of the sun that had rolled over the horizon, as if it were throwing splashes, illuminating everything around it. At such moments, Adriana tried with bated breath to transfer to canvas the beauty before her. Looking at the screen of her phone, the girl realized her father would be back soon, and he always demanded that his daughter be home at that time, waiting for his return. And despite the fact that Adriana was already old enough, her father tried to control her every move. Throwing a sad glance at the evening surface of the lake, she hurriedly gathered her things and moved towards home. Together with her father, they lived in an elite settlement within the city. Their house was quite large and well maintained, and there were even a few servants on staff. The gardener took care of the grounds, the maids did the cleaning, and the cook worked in the kitchen. They also had an elderly woman who was the oldest of the servants and had the position of steward. Long ago, she had been Adriana's nanny, and when the girl grew up, the owners could not part with this kind woman. And since she was quite lonely, she herself was happy to stay in this family. She loved the girl very much. Adriana also loved Christina very much, and after her mother's death, she began to treat her especially reverently. And today, Christina was the first to meet the girl after the walk. "Well, where are you getting to?" "Soon after all, father will be back," grumbled she. "The sunset fascinated me so much that I could hardly tear myself away." Adriana smiled dreamily. "Oh, my dreamer." The woman hugged the girl affectionately. "Now get dressed and come down for dinner," she added. After taking a shower and tidying up, Adriana went down to the living room where her father was already waiting for her. "Hello, daughter. Will you join me for dinner?" asked her father, as if Adriana had never done so before. "Of course, Daddy," the girl replied affectionately and followed her father. Christina was also present at dinner as a real member of the family, despite her strictness. James respected the woman immensely. "Your birthday is coming up." Father spoke. "I've prepared a surprise for you," he said mysteriously. "What kind of surprise?" Adriana tensed. It always alarmed her when her father spoke in riddles, not to rush things. "The birthday is still 2 months away. You'll find out everything a little later. Right now, you have to pass the session." Father continued the meal in silence. It meant that the conversation was over, and no one present tried not to break the silence. It annoyed him when the table was noisy. Adriana looked sadly at her mother's portrait, which stood nearby on the shelf. The woman was smiling a radiant smile. Mom was the complete opposite of her father. She was always fun and easy to be with. Yes, and the father was much softer, being under the influence of the charms of his charming wife. Lately, he'd been unbearable. Deep down, Adriana was even afraid of him. From Christina, she learned that her father had serious problems with business. That explained his irritability. Finished with dinner, the girl went to her room. Soon to be 19, and she had never had a relationship with a guy. Where would they come from, though? After all, her father controlled her every move. Immersed in unhappy thoughts, the girl shuddered when she heard the phone ringing. "My girl, hello, how are you?" called favorite aunt, Mom's sister. "Everything is fine," sadly answered Adriana, but having grasped, cheerfully asked, "How are you?" "I haven't seen you for 1,000 years. I missed you very much." Adriana tried to hide the excitement caused by this call. Memories of her mother were again troubling her soul. She remembered how they had visited Aunt Nancy in the village, and the time spent there had been one of the happiest memories of her childhood. "So that's actually why I'm calling." Aunt Nancy's voice was still cheerful and cheerful. "In short, I'm inviting you to come and visit me for the summer. They say it's going to be hot. We'll go swimming with you to the river." Well, how about it? The question hung in the air, and though Adriana already saw herself in the village, it would be rash to give an answer without consulting her father. "Aunt Nancy, I have a session to attend. Only after that I might be able to come, and my father must be consulted." Adriana heard a sigh of disappointment on the other end of the line. "But don't worry. I'll do my best. I'm very eager to tell you." She tried to cheer up her aunt. They agreed that Adriana would call next week and said goodbye. The village. Adriana had always envied the people who lived there. Of course, they had to work a lot harder than the city folk. and the labor was mostly physical, but they saw so much beauty every day. A wide river full of all kinds of fish, a huge deciduous forest with its gifts, fields surrounding the village from almost all sides, a holy spring, beating from under the ground, giving people crystal clear water. And this was by no means a complete list of things Adriana could bring. Several days had passed since her aunt's call, and thoughts of a possible trip to the village did not leave Adriana for a moment. Perhaps she wanted to visit once more the place where she had been so happy. After all, for the last few years she had felt unwanted by anyone. Her father had been preoccupied solely with his career, as if trying to escape his grief at work. Of course, Aunt Nancy often called, especially after the death of her sister, tried to support morally favorite niece, although she herself experienced the loss strongly. But all this was not the same. You needed someone close by to feel warm and know that someone needed you. Was the session coming to an end? Approaching the moment of the imminent conversation with her father, berating herself for being afraid of her own father, Adriana rehearsed the upcoming speech. She had hardly seen him lately, as he literally slept at work. But one day she managed to catch her father at home. He was sitting in his office when Adriana knocked timidly on the door. "May I? I wanted to talk to you." Adriana asked shyly, closing the door. "Yes, come in," her father answered absent-mindedly. He kept his eyes on the laptop, wiping the sweat from his forehead, the 3-day stubble and the wrinkled shirt alerting Adriana. Her father had always been a great pedant about everything, and his appearance had always been impeccable. But not today. Sitting down in the large leather chair across from her father, Adriana decided to start the conversation. "Aunt Nancy called me yesterday." Quietly, the girl began the conversation. "It's good that she doesn't forget you. How is she doing?" James answered, still staring at the monitor. "She's doing fine, but she's offered me something and I'd like to discuss it with you." Adriana exhaled. "Discuss?" Her father raised his eyebrows in surprise. Finally, distracted. "Okay, I'm listening. Aunt Nancy has offered to stay with her this summer, and I'd really like that." "Sure, if you don't mind," Adriana asked, lowering her voice. "Good. Go and have fun at the same time. On one condition, you have to be home by your birthday. I hope you haven't forgotten that we're having a big party." Adriana couldn't believe her happiness. She didn't think her father would even approve of the idea. "Thank you, Dad." Adriana stood up and walked over to her father and hugged him tightly. James kissed her on the top of her head and stroked her head affectionately, just as he had done when she was a child. Adriana was touched, especially when she noticed the tears in her father's eyes. "That's it, go daughter. I have work to do," abruptly he said, going back to work again. Adriana didn't bother to interrupt. All the more what she had come here for had been accomplished. But in her heart, she felt inexplicable, wistful, and sad. That evening she called her aunt, informing her of her imminent arrival, which caused a storm of positive emotions on her part. A few days later she packed her things, going to the train, the ticket for which she had bought in advance. Already sitting on the train, she was anticipating how she would spend her vacation. Everything was new to her, starting with traveling on her own. In fact, despite her advanced age, she had never traveled anywhere, so when she fell asleep to the clatter of the wheels, the smile never left her face. Early in the morning, standing on the almost deserted platform, Adriana breathed in the fresh air, the air that took her back to her childhood. "Adriana? God, how long has it been since we've seen each other?" Her aunt threw herself on her neck, and when the hottest moments of the first meeting had passed, she looked at her niece from head to foot. How beautiful you are! I can't believe it." The aunt whistled, and they both laughed. Grabbing half of Adriana's things, Aunt Nancy strode towards the motorcycle with the cradle where her neighbor was waiting for them. Adriana smiled as they rode through a large field, planted with nothing. Such an expanse for painting she hadn't seen in a long time. A multitude of wildflowers were stacked in whimsical islands, forcing her imagination to plan their arrangement on the canvas. A warm breeze blew her hair out of its braid, and despite the violent shaking, Adriana was happy. "I've made you a bed. It's much cooler here. It's very stuffy in the house now," Auntie commanded. After unpacking her things, Adriana went out onto the porch and looked at the familiar, but almost forgotten outlines of the neighbors' houses. Nothing seemed to have changed since she had been here with her mother. "Let's go to lunch, sweetheart." Putting a hand on her shoulder, Aunt Nancy spoke. Adriana brushed away a sudden tear and followed her. They were to dine in the garden, in a gazebo surrounded by a thicket of grapes. It was strange, but she and her father never ate in the garden, even though it was beautiful, preferring to do so only at home. And here, dining al fresco seemed so obvious that Adriana ate even more than usual. If it goes on, waking up, barely the sun showed from behind the horizon. The girl took her easel and went out to the backyard, where she had a beautiful view. After making a few sketches, Adriana hurried to help her aunt at breakfast, anticipating the trip to the lake. The freedom of movement made her wildly excited, and walking through familiar and dear to her heart, she was plunged into a carefree and happy childhood. "Are you settling in?" Aunt Nancy asked. "Yes, a little. The nature here, of course, is crazy." Adriana shared her impressions. Although Auntie saw everything perfectly well, those bright and cheerful eyes reminded her so much of her sister. Only it was noticeable that Adriana was stiff and as if she was afraid of being judged for any of her actions. "This is not a city. It's a real place to live," the woman replied thoughtfully. They had a quick snack, some of the food they had brought with them, and put it in the basket. They grabbed their beach gear and headed to the beach by the lake. The splendor before the girls' eyes was astounding. The boundless lake with the clearest water was surrounded by pine trees on 3 sides. Perhaps the landscape is not inferior to foreign resorts. Adriana smiled. "You should have brought an easel. You'll have time, believe me, and today let's go sunbathing and swimming." Aunt Nancy nodded towards the blanket she had spread out. Adriana took off her sundress, leaving her in a fashionable bronze-colored swimsuit. She had taken care of the purchase of this article of clothing in advance, knowing that she would definitely be swimming in the local body of water. Suddenly, the girl felt someone's gaze on her. Turning around, she noticed a familiar group of young people who had passed by their house last night. Looking at her was still the same guy as yesterday. Only today his gaze was a little different. Today it was as if he was studying her, unashamedly examining her from head to toe. That piercing gaze made Adriana uncomfortable. She sat down next to Aunt Nancy and pulled out a book, trying to concentrate, but it wasn't working, so she glanced around at the group. Suddenly, one of the girls walked up to the guy and literally hung around his neck. Adriana looked at him disappointedly and turned away, feeling a strange feeling. After lying in the hot sun for a while, Adriana and her aunt decided to take a dip. Her eyes involuntarily cast a glance at the place where that very company was resting. But this guy Adriana did not notice. Instead, she saw the girl who was with him, who now sat alone and was obviously upset about something. The water in the lake was really beautiful, despite the fact that it was quite cool. According to Auntie's story, the reason for this was because of the underground springs flowing directly into the lake. Adriana and Aunt Nancy came home in the late afternoon and started cooking dinner. You won't believe it, but I haven't had such a wonderful time in a long time, Auntie confessed. There was no suitable company. You know, when my husband died, I thought my heart would burst with sadness, but time heals. I realized that my business on this earth was not yet finished. And though fate didn't reward me with children, I have you, and I haven't felt as good as I do today in a very long time. Aunt Nancy brushed away her tears. Adriana rushed to comfort her. Aunt Nancy, why don't you move in with us? We have a big house, and Daddy, I think, will not mind, suggested the girl. No, honey, I belong here. It's where I belong, and it's where I'll end up. But I want you not to forget this place. After all, this house will be yours when I die. Adriana did not answer anything. She pressed Aunt Nancy against her chest and stroked her wavy hair, from which gray strands came out. After they had cried enough, they went back to the houses. It was getting dark, but Adriana didn't want to go to bed. She went out onto the veranda and brought a warm blanket and a cup of herbal tea. Leaning back in the old armchair, she looked up at the stars and dreamed. Hearing the creak of the wicket door opening, the girl shuddered. On the path directly to her stepped the same young man, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. The girl froze from fear and excitement at the same time, but did not move. "Hello, stranger. I'm sorry to intrude, but I had no other choice. I didn't know where or when I could see you again." The guide looked her straight in the eyes and smiled. "This is for you," he said, holding out the flowers to her. Adriana accepted them and gave the young man her radiant smile. "May I sit down?" he asked. "I suppose you may, but you have to introduce yourself." The girl answered not bravely, trying to hide her excitement. "Ethan," the young man answered immediately. "And you, Adriana, are you? How do you know?" She was surprised. "I had to find out." The boy smiled. Adriana noticed a shadow in the window of the dark room and realized that it was watching them, but she did not interfere with their acquaintance. "Would your girlfriend be unhappy that you came here?" she decided to ask Adriana. It was a question that had been on her mind ever since she had seen them hugging on the beach. "I don't have a girlfriend. Lisa is just a friend. We rent a house near you for the second summer in a row. There are 5 of us, 3 boys and 2 girls. We all go to a university in the city together. We saw this place by chance, but we fell in love with it." Ethan's voice was so pleasant that Adriana was ready to listen to it all night. Finally, the tension between them was gone, and Adriana even decided to tell him briefly about her life. The time passed quickly, and they said goodbye when dawn was about to break. Adriana immediately fell asleep in her cozy bed with thoughts of her new acquaintance. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to the house where his friends were waiting for him. "How did it go?" Michael asked. "Good girl. She seemed to like me. I think I'm going to win this bet," answered Ethan. "We'll see." Michael had set Ethan up for a bet when they were at the lake. Noticing the look in his friend's eyes, he said, "She's a cool girl, but I don't think you'll get anywhere. She's not likely to look at the average guy. That girl's not your type, bro." But Ethan looked at him with burning eyes, unable to look away. He really liked her very much, but his friend's words struck a blow to the young and proud lad's ego. "You'll see, she'll be mine. With heat," he said. "Want to bet?" Michael got into the game, you bet. The other friends didn't say anything about the bet, and Lisa was the only one who heard. She liked Ethan very much and followed him around, dreaming of getting him, but the boy didn't seem to notice all her attempts to get closer to him. That evening she followed him and saw him going to Adriana's place. The resentment and anger was very strong, but she tried not to give the appearance that she knew everything. Adriana greeted the new day with the sun shining through the window. She smiled as she stretched sweetly, remembering last night. "Wake up, sleepyhead. It's time for breakfast." Her aunt called her affectionately. "5 minutes and I'll be ready," Adriana said. She quickly slipped her feet into her slippers and hurried to the bathroom. After changing her clothes, she went into the kitchen when everything was ready for breakfast. "I'm sorry, I didn't help you at all," she apologized. "Come on, it's my pleasure to take care of you. You don't know how important it is to know you have someone to take care of you." Feeling like she might cry at any minute, she decided to change the subject. "By the way, I heard voices under our window tonight." She looked questioningly at her niece, smiling slyly. "Yes, that guy we saw at the lake came by. He wanted to meet me." Adriana's face flushed. "Well, I hope he succeeded." "He did." The girl blushed even more. "I just don't know how to behave around guys," she admitted. "You don't need to know anything. If you like him, act like your heart tells you to. Just be yourself," the woman replied. They had a lot of things planned for the day, so Adriana could only get free in the evening, and just as she entered the house, she heard a soft knock on the door. Opening it, she froze in place. Ethan was standing in front of her, holding a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. "Thank you." The girl smiled, accepting the bouquet. "How would you like to go for a walk in the village?" I don't know. I need to shower and change," the girl replied excitedly. She was desperate to go for a walk with him. "Great. I'll wait on the porch. I hope your aunt won't mind?" "I don't think so." Adriana shrugged. When Ethan was out the door, she rushed into the shower, thinking about what outfit to wear for the walk. She smiled at her reflection in the mirror and stepped out. Ethan was sitting on the veranda with Aunt Nancy, drinking tea and talking nicely when Adriana came up to them. "Adriana, there's a guy asking for permission to go for a walk with you. I had to meet him so I can let you go with him in peace." Adriana looked at her questioningly. "I can see he's a good guy, so I'm letting him go." Seeing her niece's tension, she hurried to leave them alone. Ethan behaved much more easily today than the day before. He joked a lot and told interesting stories. Adriana learned that he was studying to be a doctor and dreamed of becoming a serious specialist in cardiology, and she, in turn, told about her passion for painting. "Cool. Can I see your paintings with interest?" asked Ethan. "They are all left at home in my studio, but I can paint a painting especially for you," she offered. "That would be great." The boy was delighted. Ethan behaved very gallantly, not allowing himself anything extra. The walk ended in the late afternoon, leaving both of them with only positive emotions. From that day on, the young people were inseparable. Ethan went to fetch Adriana in the morning, and sometimes they returned in the morning. Aunt Nancy did not discourage their meetings. On the contrary, she liked Ethan very much, and she could see that her niece was truly in love. Adriana felt that Ethan was her man, but even if he wasn't rich, that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was that she realized that he had the same feelings for her as she did. Of course, her father may be against their relationship, but Adriana tried not to think about it and just enjoy communication with her beloved. The couple often discussed joint plans for the future, where they could not imagine that they could not be together. "This is the first time I have this," said Ethan, sitting on the shore of the lake, which became their favorite place for dates. "I can't be without you for a minute. I've had girlfriends before too, but that doesn't compare to how I feel about you." The guide pulled Adriana to him and kissed her gently. "What about Lisa? Did you go out with her too?" The girl asked, smiling. "No, although I know she wants to be with me. But now I don't need anyone but you." Ethan looked Adriana straight in the eyes. "I will love you always, no matter what happens," he whispered, not taking his eyes off her. She was a little embarrassed, because it was the first time she had ever heard such words. Nevertheless, the vacation was coming to an end, bringing the inevitable parting with her lover, with her aunt, and with this beautiful place, which had given her so many wonderful moments that Adriana felt that she had not lived a real life before this trip. Though she and Ethan had agreed that they would meet as soon as they arrived, an inexplicable sadness never left Adriana. "Tonight is our last night. Tomorrow you will leave," Ethan said sadly. "You make it sound like we'll never see each other again." Adriana smiled, snuggling up to the guy who was the most important person in her life. They were sitting on a cliff surrounded by pine trees. There was a beautiful view of their favorite lake. Ethan grabbed a blanket and a picnic basket of food. "I haven't told you, but I love you very much as I possibly can." Ethan professed his love, looking Adriana straight in the eyes. There was no doubt in his sincerity. He gently touched her lips with his, pulling Adriana close to him. Tonight they decided to spend the night together, as if it was their last time together. This time, their date didn't end until dawn. In the evening, Adriana had already bought a train ticket. "I will definitely come to see you off." Ethan whispered goodbye. As she packed her things, Adriana remembered her promise to give Ethan the painting. Speaking of which, it was already finished. She wanted to leave him something to remember it by. She gathered herself, grabbed the gift, and headed toward the house where Ethan lived with his friends. As she got closer, Adriana felt a strange excitement, but continued on her way. The door was opened by Lisa. "Please call Ethan," Adriana asked. "Ethan has gone to town." "Didn't you know?" Lisa looked at the confused Adriana with undisguised gloating. "Why would he report to you, though? Who are you?" "He got everything he wanted from you." The girl laughed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Adriana sat down on the bench outside the house, feeling her legs shaking from the sudden realization. What's there to understand? Ethan had bet with the boys that he'd get you into bed. You were so unapproachable at first, and then yesterday he told me what happened. He got fed up with you, so he left. Understand? Adriana couldn't believe what she was hearing. After all, she felt Ethan loved her. Could one play a crush so skillfully? She heard Adriana say something else in her back, but she hurried out of the place. Waiting for the train on the platform, Adriana looked at the faces of passers-by, wishing she could see the one she loved among them. And she hoped that he would explain everything to her, hug and comfort her, but time passed and he was still not there. "Honey, what's wrong? Your face is gone." Her aunt was worried, seeing her off. Of course, she understood who her niece was looking for in the passers-by. It's all right. Thank you for a wonderful vacation. If it hadn't been for you." Adriana stammered and cried, throwing herself on her neck. After sobbing for a few minutes, they heard the announcement of an incoming train and hurriedly calmed down. It never came. Adriana's mind was spinning as the train moved off. So Lisa was telling the truth. She concluded. She had some time to think about it. Eventually, she realized that it was exactly as the girl had said. Otherwise, how else would she have known that they had intimacy yesterday? Thinking about the fact that he had easily, or maybe even in great detail, told his friends about it was vile and disgusting. How could he? Resentment gradually replaced anger. Her father's driver was waiting for her on the platform, carefully packing her things into the car. The house met with the usual cold silence. It even seemed to Adriana that the vacation was just a dream. A note from her father, lying on the table in her room, said she would see him tonight and have an important conversation. Glancing at the portrait of her mother on the shelf, Adriana could barely hold back her tears. Suddenly, she realized that she had no one to share her worries with. A little later, Christina came in. She sincerely missed her pupil, and so did Adriana, but something in her behavior was bothering her. The woman threw pitying glances in Adriana's direction, and when she asked her questions, she changed the subject. Her father came late in the evening, when Adriana had given up hope of waiting for him and was about to go to bed. He knocked gently on the door of her room. "Are you awake?" he asked, and after receiving a negative answer, he quietly entered the room and sat down in the chair opposite his daughter. Adriana realized that she missed her father very much. For a moment, she wanted to throw herself into his arms, cuddling like a little girl. But assessing the situation, she changed her mind. Her father hadn't seen her in almost 2 months, and not a single muscle on his face showed any emotion when they met. Adriana's heart clenched. Glancing at her mom's picture, Adriana dared to ask, "What did you want to talk to me about?" "Your birthday is coming up. I've decided to organize an evening at the Count's restaurant. Many important people will be there." "I'll introduce you to a lot of people," Dad said. "Thank you, but why do I need those people? I'd rather celebrate my birthday in a family circle." Shyly objected the girl. "It's out of the question. I've decided everything. Besides, the preparations for the party are in full swing. You should outshine everyone. You have time to prepare." The father stood up and headed for the door. "Good night," he said and walked out. Adriana sat on the bed with her legs tucked up. The phone vibrated, announcing an incoming message. It was her aunt writing, worried. Adriana smiled. It had probably been a long time since she had received such warmth. Communicating with Aunt Nancy helped to distract her from unpleasant thoughts for a while. Saying goodbye, the girl fell into a deep sleep. The new morning greeted her with drizzling rain and cold wind. The sky was covered with bulky gray clouds, giving no chance for a single ray of light to penetrate. Adriana sighed heavily, looking out the window. The weather reflected the state of her soul to the fullest extent. Every minute she thought of Ethan and what he had done. Her heart leaped out of her chest, and tears welled up in her eyes at the memory of him. Wrapping herself in a warm blanket, Adriana went to her small workshop. There she was finally able to forget. Taking in her hands brushes and paints, the girl plunged into painting. Remembering the native features of the face, Adriana wrote a portrait of her beloved that broke her heart. The girl did not notice how the time flew by. She woke up only when she heard the sound of the front door opening and her father's loud voice. Looking down, Adriana was startled. Her father was clearly drunk, as evidenced by his awkward movements and his extremely wrinkled and unkempt appearance. "I said no, okay. To sell the factory is to declare bankruptcy. I'll find a way out," shouted James. Adriana stepped back so her father wouldn't see her. It was the first time she had seen him like that in her life. Something terrible must have happened, Adriana thought. She couldn't explain her father's behavior any other way. Slowly making her way to the kitchen so as not to run into her father, Adriana waited for Christina. "Adriana, what are you doing here at this hour?" Entering the kitchen, the woman raised her eyebrows in surprise. "I need to talk to you." "Did you see the state your father came in?" "Yes, but you shouldn't worry about that. He's been a bit tired lately." Apparently, he decided to relax. The woman spoke quickly, not looking into the eyes of her interlocutor. "Relax? He's wasted. I've never seen him like that. What's wrong? Do you know anything about it? Am I the only one in the dark? I don't know anything, but I assure you it's all right. Now go to bed. It's getting late. Christina tried to end the conversation quickly. That night, Adriana didn't sleep well. The feeling of uneasiness did not leave her. Ethan's face and Lisa laughing at her were on her mind. So she woke up in a bad mood with a sore head. Her father was not present at breakfast, so Adriana resolutely went in search of him in his office. She was determined to find out what was going on with him. The door to the study was open, and she ventured in without knocking. James sat leaning back in his chair and thinking about something. His eyes were red, proving that he had spent the night without sleep. When he heard his daughter's footsteps, he flinched. Adriana? He was surprised to see her. Come in, we need to talk. The girl sat down across from him and waited intently. You're old enough to understand the things we're going to talk about. I hope to have your support. The beginning didn't promise anything good, so Adriana tensed inwardly. My firm is in a critical state. I'm on the verge of bankruptcy, plus huge debts. What do I do about it? I don't know yet. But one thing is certain, you need to make arrangements for your future. James paused, trying not to look his daughter in the eye. Your birthday is coming up. As promised, I'll throw you a big party. But Dad, Adriana wanted to reassure her father, for it was the first time in years that he seemed so pathetic, making him seem even smaller in stature. She wanted to argue that she didn't need the party, that she shouldn't spend money on it, which she didn't have, but her father interrupted her sharply. The matter is settled. Please listen to me to the end and do not interrupt me. So this evening I will introduce you to your future husband. He finally finished. Adriana was so shocked that she was speechless for a while, and only after a few minutes she said in a quiet voice, I don't understand how you can make such decisions for me. Who gave you that right? I am a free man. Besides, there is a man I am in love with, so your plans are not destined to come true. Adriana looked at her father defiantly, not expecting herself to be so bold. There was no response, so she stood up and went silently to her room. It was the first time she'd objected to her father, so it was particularly nasty, and even more so that he'd decided to control her fate without her knowledge. Opening the only surviving joint photo of her together with Ethan on her phone, the girl cried. For the next few days she tried not to leave the room unnecessarily. Her father, too, seemed to avoid communicating with her. She had learned from Christina that he was just as late coming home from work and almost always invariably drunk. The time on the calendar was drawing closer to her birthday. One night before going to bed, James came to reconcile with his daughter. He spoke so softly, was so affectionate, as he had been in his distant childhood when her mother was still alive. So Adriana melted and listened to her father. All I'm doing is taking care of you, sweetheart. I don't want you to stay on the streets because anything can happen. David, he's a good man and he's been wanting to get to know you, so don't push him away. He'll make a good husband. He said many other things about the mysterious groom, marveling at his intelligence and success. They talked until almost midnight, and Adriana promised to think hard. In the morning, it was barely dawn, and she decided to call her aunt for advice. She knew she was awake, for the village was a busy place from the early hours of the morning. She had seen it for herself. Adriana, my girl, how good to hear you, said Aunt Nancy. Her voice brought an involuntary smile to her lips. I wanted to say so much and ask so many questions, but the lump in my throat prevented me from doing either. How are you doing? Why don't you say anything? Aunt Nancy asked cautiously. I don't know. said Adriana and exclaimed. The words mixed with tears flowed by themselves. Adriana was confused but recounted the events of the last few days. There was silence on the other end. Aunt Nancy, has Ethan asked about me? Have you seen him? Shyly, Adriana asked what she had long wanted to ask. I haven't. They left the village the same day you did, Auntie answered. Please, darling, don't cry. We'll think of something. I'll talk to your father. You can't marry against your will. It's the Stone Age. She was indignant. After a little more talk with her aunt, Adriana began to calm down, having received the support of someone close to her. Auntie promised to call back in a couple of days, assuring her that everything would be fine. She called back, except this time the conversation did not bring Adriana comfort. She confusedly advised her niece to take a closer look at David and not to take things lightly. Adriana was surprised at the change in Aunt Nancy's mood. After all, now everyone was against her. On the eve of the holiday, her father had brought her a fancy dress in which she was to appear before the guests. But Adriana did not want to have fun at all. Every evening closing in her studio, she put all her pain and longing in her paintings, and her thoughts carry her back to the short time she spent with her beloved. The events of the festive evening unfolded rapidly. At the appointed time, she and her father arrived at the restaurant. A lot of strangers frightened her and made her uncomfortable, but it should be credited to her father, because he practically the whole evening did not leave her a step away. Looking at the faces of the guests, Adriana wondered who David was. To her surprise, for almost half of the evening, he was not visible among the guests. A pleasant slow song began to play, and couples began to walk to the center of the room. When Adriana looked around, she didn't notice that she was alone. Her father had disappeared unnoticed. Can the birthday girl do me this honor and dance this slow dance with me? Adriana heard a man's voice behind her. When she turned around, she saw a man who, smiling, was looking at her intently. Without waiting for an answer, he pulled her to him and dragged her into the crowd of dancing couples. Throughout the dance, the stranger did not utter another word. Adriana waited impatiently for the music to end, for the man was clearly overstepping his bounds, pressing her so tightly that she could hardly breathe. Finally, the music ended, and he disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. Suddenly, a bright light came on, and her father's loud voice came through the microphone. Dear friends, I am glad to welcome you to the birthday party in honor of the birthday of my only and beloved daughter. It was felt that James had already knocked over more than one glass of champagne. In addition, I would like to introduce you to my future son-in-law and announce the engagement of my daughter and David. The guests clapped. Some even started whistling. Adriana was more excited than ever. Suddenly, the stranger with whom she had been dancing stepped towards her and put his arm around her waist and stood beside her. Friends, the father continued, I also want to inform you that David is my companion from today. Please love and welcome. A satisfied smile never left the face of the new bridegroom. He was obviously pleased with himself. He was enjoying himself, and Adriana was the only one among the crowd of guests who felt superfluous. She looked at the groom. She sighed louder than etiquette allowed. This was not the groom she had envisioned. She thought he would be about her age or a little older. She even thought she might get used to him and perhaps even like him. After all, it had happened more than once in some people's lives. Christina tried to assure her of that every evening, telling her various stories from the lives of people she knew. Adriana. In the old days, no one asked anyone about love. The parents of the bride and groom would agree, that's all. And over the years, people became a real family. A woman told me. That's how it was in the old days. Now everyone marries for love. And how can you love a man you've never met? What if we don't like each other? Adriana asked Christina. So how could I not like you? You can't find such beauty by day and night. But slowly, in the course of such discussions, Adriana began to set herself up for a favorable outcome of the acquaintance. After all, if he disgusts me, my father will not force me to marry him. The girl thought, and now standing near her fiancé, who was 10 or maybe 15 years older than her, Adriana found herself at a complete loss. Someone came up with congratulations, but she heard nothing at all. Ethan's face flashed back into her imagination, so dear and beloved, and that groom was standing there smiling arrogantly, holding her as if she were his property. The girl got out of his embrace and walked away from the crowd. Tears came to her eyes. Sitting down on the couch in the hall, she let the tears flow, making sure no one was around. Tears of happiness. She suddenly heard a woman's voice. A pretty, slender brunette stood next to her with a glass of champagne. I'm sorry, Adriana couldn't find anything to say. And what can you say to a stranger? Don't apologize, it's fine. Betty. The stranger held out her hand and smiled. I have a proposition. Why don't I get us some champagne in honor of our acquaintance? Adriana nodded. Why not? It wouldn't hurt to relax and distract herself a bit right now. Betty seemed like a nice girl. They sat down at a table at the end of the room and chatted casually. You're a nice girl, said Betty. Although, to be honest, I thought you were an arrogant know-it-all, considering who your father is, confessed the new acquaintance. Adriana couldn't find anything to say, but smiled. My fiancé dumped me today. Can you believe it? He just said that it's over between us, and he's marrying someone else. Betty spoke with pain in her voice. How could he? You're so beautiful. Adriana tried to calm her down. Apparently, money decides everything in this life. No one needs love. The girl replied sadly. I believe in love, and you do too. He will definitely regret his deed and come back. Adriana didn't have time to finish, as she noticed that David and her father were approaching their table. What are you doing here? He asked Betty rudely. Just congratulating the bride. Don't worry, I was just leaving. Betty stood up and headed for the exit. What right do you have to send my guests away? Adriana asked sternly. She wasn't on the guest list. Don't worry, dear. I'm just protecting you from unnecessary socializing. David smiled, but the smile seemed strained, more like a grin. Let me decide for myself what kind of communication I want and what I don't want. Adriana objected rudely and, apologizing, followed Betty. Unfortunately for her, the girl had already left the restaurant. Adriana spent the rest of the evening avoiding everyone, including her father. She wanted to get home as soon as possible to get her thoughts together. When the evening was finally over, Adriana was relieved to enter her room and sit on her bed, completely drained of energy. There was no point in talking to her father tonight, but tomorrow the conversation would have to take place. That was what Adriana decided as she fell asleep. Waking up and without waiting for breakfast, the girl headed to her father's study. He was already there. We need to talk. Adriana began abruptly. The father looked at his daughter with bewilderment. She had never used such a tone when talking to him. I don't want to marry David. Please let him know that. The matter of your marriage is settled and is not subject to discussion. David's father repeated for the umpteenth time. He's a very promising young man. You will certainly get along with him. Young? He's at least 10 years older than I am. Besides, I didn't like him at all. He's arrogant and conceited. I don't want to marry him, Dad. Adriana couldn't help screaming. Enough. I've already told you that my finances are bad and we could be left on the street. So I'm concerned about your future. Too bad, Daddy, that for the first time in my life, I'll have to go against your will. I want to love and be loved too. Have you forgotten what it's like to live with someone you love? Adriana knew she had struck a nerve. Her father was still suffering from the loss of his wife and tried not to broach such topics with anyone. Suddenly, her father sank into a chair and lowered his head and sobbed. Adriana was shocked by what was happening, not knowing how to behave. I have always loved your mother, just idolized. And believe me, I have not forgotten how happy it was, said my father through sobs. After losing her, I focused on work, trying to distract myself from the pain and emptiness that settled in my heart. I put everything on the line for my success, but lately things have been going from bad to worse. Competitors have been digging at me, sending various inspections. I've had to suspend production. Creditors are demanding debts, and there is nothing to pay. David offered to work together and provide financial assistance. He has great connections in all structures, and in return, he wanted to become my son-in-law. Her father looked her straight in the eye. Please, my daughter, agree. Don't break your old man's heart. I won't survive the loss of the firm. Adriana silently walked out of the office. There were no tears. Her thoughts were jumbled in her head. She went up to the studio and began to paint. She painted furiously, without stopping for a minute, and didn't leave until the next morning. Concerned, Christina was already waiting for her. Adriana, what's wrong? Everything is fine. The girl replied dryly, Tell my father that I agree. Let us start preparing for the wedding. When the door closed behind Christina, Adriana spoke aloud, looking at the picture of her mom. I will do what he wants for you, Mom. I don't want him to suffer. And the fact that he made me a bargaining chip, let it remain on his conscience. From that day on, Adriana didn't care about anything that happened next. And then the days passed from one to the other in the hustle and bustle of the wedding. The endless fitting of the wedding dress and other preparations did not cause Adriana any interest. She saw David twice more when he came to see his father, and then only in passing. He seemed to have no tenderness or interest in the bride. On the day of the wedding, Adriana stood in her gorgeous wedding gown, trying to control her tears. A multitude of guests took turns saying their congratulations and wishing happiness and love to the young ones. The bride thought about her own thoughts and listened to almost nothing. Occurring periodically, nausea and dizziness did not give rest. The thing is that 2 weeks before the planned celebration, Adriana found out that she was pregnant. This news at first caused a wild horror, and then she realized that this way she would find the meaning of life, and the baby would be her salvation from loneliness. There was no doubt that Ethan was the father, as Adriana was not close to anyone else. This fact both pleased and frightened her. On the one hand, the child would have a part of her favorite man, and Adriana didn't want to have children from her unloved husband. But how would David feel about it? After all, he would surely find out. Adriana tried not to think about that for the moment. Aunt Nancy's absence from the party was worrying, because she wanted to see her most of all. But neither her father nor Christina could explain why Auntie was not on the guest list. Her phone was silent during all Adriana's attempts to call her. The groom talked more with the guests than with the bride. Only occasionally, under cries of bitterness, he roughly raked her into an armful for a kiss. When the celebration was over, she had to get home alone. Of course, a car with a driver was waiting for her near the restaurant. Otherwise, it could not be otherwise, given the financial situation of the newly married husband. Unfortunately, at the end of the next day, Adriana went to the doctor to register her pregnancy. The due date was almost 3 months. It had been exactly that long since she had last seen Ethan. She tried to keep thoughts of him out of her mind because they caused tears and worry, and she couldn't be nervous. She plunged into waiting for the baby. Adriana almost tried not to pay attention to the strange behavior of her husband, and there were strange things. Now he controlled her every move. She couldn't go anywhere without a driver, and only when she went to her father's house could she get away from the eyes that were always watching her. Adriana lacked socialization. That's why she found a note with Betty's phone number in the pocket of her coat and dialed the number. "Betty, this is Adriana. Remember at my birthday party?" "Of course I remember." Betty answered quickly. "How are you?" "Why don't we get together?" "I'd love to," Adriana answered. The girls agreed to meet in the park in the evening. The meeting went beautifully. The girls talked a lot about everything. It even seemed to Adriana that they had known each other for many years. "How was it married?" Betty asked shyly. Sighing heavily, Adriana replied, "I don't know. We're strangers. We don't talk much. Only about the pregnancy. But I can't help it. I promised my father." Adriana felt tears come to her eyes. "Didn't you marry for love?" "Any girl would be happy to be David's wife." "Perhaps, but not me. I saw him for the first time on the day of the engagement, and my father had already made up his mind for me. And though my heart belongs to another man, I can't betray my father. It's important to him, and he is the only family I have," Adriana answered sadly. Betty was silent. For the rest of the walk, she was very thoughtful and taciturn. But saying goodbye, the girls agreed to meet again in a couple of days. The next morning, Adriana had an unpleasant conversation with her husband. "With whom did you meet yesterday?" he asked. As soon as Adriana came down for breakfast. "A friend. What does it matter? Or am I not allowed to do that anymore?" Adriana looked into David's eyes. His prickly gaze made her uncomfortable. "Okay, here's the deal. I forbid you to see her. Is that clear?" he asked, raising his tone. "What right do you have to control my life?" Adriana shouted, unable to hold back her tears. "I am not your property, David. You are mistaken, my dear, and you'll soon find out." Her husband's haughty smile resembled a grin. Adriana stood up silently and went to her room, wiping away her tears. The next evening, she decided to have a serious talk with her father. It couldn't go on like this. Going into her father's study, she began at once about the main thing. "Father, I can't go on like this. I want a divorce." Hearing her words, her father turned very pale. "Are you crazy, daughter? How could you think of such a thing?" In the evening, David told her that his cousin and his fiancée were coming to visit them the other day. "Please prepare everything for their arrival," he said sternly. "Everything must be dignified. I hope you understand me?" Adriana nodded in response. Selecting an outfit to meet the guests, Adriana wore a soft blue dress in the color of her eyes, a little loose cut, though it was hard not to notice her belly, which was growing by the day. At Adriana's orders, the servants had prepared a festive dinner of poultry and numerous appetizers. As she made her way down to the table, Adriana heard the sound of voices coming from the parlor. Apparently, David had arrived at the same time as the guests, because his voice was the most audible. For a moment, Adriana froze. One of the voices sounded very familiar. Her heart was pounding frantically. Her legs became absorbent cotton. The girl could not move from her seat. "Meet my dear brother, my wife Adriana." David introduced her. Ethan stood in front of her, amazed as much as she was, and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Ethan," he said. Behind him stood Lisa, smiling wryly. For a moment, Adriana thought she was going to faint. Noticing the pallor on her face, Ethan asked, "Are you all right? You don't look well." "Don't worry, brother. It's just that my wife is pregnant, and I'm going to have an heir soon." David laughed. "Congratulations," Ethan replied quietly. "Well, let's get to the table." Invited the owner of the house. At the table, Ethan sat across from Adriana and kept his eyes on her. Lisa was angry and tried to distract her fiancé. "I'm sorry, David, that we couldn't come to your wedding." Ethan is literally obsessed with his studies, and after he was invited to work at the Heart Center, I don't see him at home. Lisa defiantly hugged Ethan defiantly with a challenging look at a pale Adriana. "I hope you'll definitely come to our wedding." "Will it be soon?" David asked. "We haven't decided anything yet, so it's too early to talk about it." Ethan cut in. Adriana was silent. It was obvious that she was hurt by these words. When it was time for the hot pot, David suddenly shouted, "Who do you think is going to eat this crap?" He turned to his wife, pointing at the forbidden turkey. "I thought everyone would like it." Adriana replied, confused, "Next time, before you think with your chicken brain, consult your husband." David couldn't stop. Apparently, the strong drinks were already doing their job. "I don't see what the problem is. I have a lot of respect for turkey." Ethan stood up for Adriana. "Don't," she whispered, looking at him. Tears glistened in her eyes. She left the table and quickly went to her room. "Why do you treat your wife like this, and even pregnant? Hasn't time changed you at all?" Ethan asked. She deserved it. "Besides, I don't need counselors." David answered rudely. "I agree with David. Why serve something your husband doesn't like?" Lisa interjected. "Shut up already. You've said enough today." Ethan looked at Lisa with irritation. "Why did you come here?" "I don't suppose it was out of great affection for your cousin?" David asked, and the men went out to the veranda to continue their conversation in private. Adriana was crying in her room. The feelings that were overwhelming her were bursting out now. She realized that she still loved Ethan. That made the pain seem even worse. That evening, Ethan and Lisa stayed the night. Adriana realized this when she caught Ethan having a cup of coffee in the kitchen in the early morning. "Hi, will you join us?" Ethan asked. "No, thanks. I think you should wait for your fiancé, and I'll have tea in my room," answered Adriana. "Your room? Are you and David living in separate rooms? I'm sorry, but I don't think it's any of your business." Adriana sneered, and taking the cup of tea she prepared, she wanted to turn around and leave. She felt Ethan grab her arm. "I think we need to talk." Adriana looked silently into his eyes, in which she was drowning by the minute. She realized that the conversation was inevitable, but she tried to delay it. "What is there to talk about? How you bet your friends that you could easily get me into bed? Or maybe you want to tell me how long you laughed at me after it happened." Adriana's voice trembled, tears welling up in her eyes. "What argument? What stupidity? I was shocked when you left without even saying goodbye. I ran to your aunt, but she asked me to leave you alone. I begged her for your address, but she was adamant. I tried to find you, but I realized I didn't even know your last name." Ethan fell silent. "I don't believe you. Especially now, it doesn't matter anymore." Adriana sighed. "You don't love him and you're unhappily married now, right? That's none of your business. You made your choice back then." Adriana pulled her hand out of his and ran upstairs. Her temples throbbed and her heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it would literally burst out of her chest. The girl dialed Betty's number and told her everything. "What do you think to do?" asked her friend. "I don't know." Adriana exclaimed, "I don't know anything." "Should you tell him that your baby is his?" Betty had long been privy to this secret. After all, lately she was the only person Adriana could share it with. The girl always sincerely sympathized with her friend, was aware of the rather strange relationship between her and her husband. He had a wedding coming up. Why would he want to know that? Perhaps Lisa would soon give him her children. Adriana replied sadly, "Don't be upset. We'll think of something. Besides, your father has promised to settle things and authorize the divorce. The most important thing is to stop being nervous. In your condition, it's dangerous for the baby." Talking to her friend calmed Adriana down a bit. She decided not to go downstairs that day. And the next day the guests were gone. The time passed, but the father could not get things sorted out yet. The pregnancy was coming to its logical conclusion, so Adriana was very worried. She had not seen Ethan again, although he had managed to give her his card with his contacts through the maid. David looked at her like she was nothing at best, and sometimes he snapped at her, picking on her for every little thing. On the due date, Adriana gave birth to a beautiful baby girl and named her Emily after her mother. When she looked at her, she was amazed. The baby was an exact copy of her father. Even the mole on her left cheek she inherited from him. She was met from the hospital by a driver sent by her husband and Christina and Betty. On the first evening at home, there was a scandal. David came home from work drunk and immediately blamed his wife. "How worthless you are. You can't even give birth to a son." "I wanted a son and hair." "And what's this?" He pointed to the cradle where the baby was sleeping quietly. "What are you talking about, David? You knew it wasn't your child from the start, but you pretended it wasn't. What hair are you talking about?" "Yeah, I can't have kids, okay? And I was counting on this baby. I mean, he was born in wedlock, which means no one would question our parentage. The girl was not part of my plans." He shouted, "Don't you worry. We'll be going home soon, and you won't have to endure our presence." Adriana replied, as calmly as possible. David laughed and pushed Adriana against the wall. "You're wrong," he hissed. "You have nowhere to go back to. Everything your father has is signed over to me. I've got him on a tight leash. He won't say a word against me. So unless you want me to throw him out on the street in his pants, and you and your baby. Anyway, my dear wife, I advise you to think very carefully." "What's all this for?" she asked, hardly breathing. "The time will come, and you'll know everything. Be patient, my dear. But I warn you not to be silly, otherwise Daddy or Nurse may suffer, and maybe our daughter." David burst into wild laughter. The baby cried. Adriana rushed to comfort the child. Adriana was stunned. She realized that David was not normal, and now she was even more afraid of him. She had only been able to call her father once. From the conversation, she realized that she would not get support from him. He was clearly not himself, habitually mumbling to her to bear with her a little longer. David had organized a party to celebrate the birth of the child. All his friends and Ethan and Lisa were invited. The party took place in the living room on the first floor, so Adriana preferred not to go down to the guests for fear of leaving the baby alone for even a moment. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was Ethan. "May I?" he asked shyly. Adriana nodded silently. Ethan walked over to the crib and looked at the baby. "She's so cute. I've never seen such pretty babies," he smiled. Adriana's heart sank as she watched the tenderness with which Ethan looked at his daughter. "I wish he hadn't noticed the resemblance." Adriana repeated to herself, The girl cried, and she immediately picked her up in her arms. "Motherhood suits you. You are even more beautiful," Ethan said affectionately. Adriana could hardly keep herself from throwing herself at his neck and telling him how she felt and who he was to her daughter. But suddenly, almost at the very door, Lisa's voice sounded, searching for Ethan. "You have to go," Adriana said sadly. "I hope I'll see you again. At least, I'd like that very much," Ethan said quietly and walked out. 2 weeks later, the little girl fell ill. She had a fever. There were no other symptoms. She screamed all the time, and the antipyretics hardly worked at all. "Call a doctor, please," Adriana asked her husband. "No need to worry. It's just a cold," David assured her. "Please, the child is not well. Can't you see?" she begged. "All right. The doctor will come here tomorrow," David replied indifferently. All evening the girl was capricious, and by night, Adriana realized that the matter was much more serious than she thought. The girl's lips began to turn blue, and an attack of suffocation caused a wild horror to her mother. Not knowing what to do, Adriana dialed Ethan's number on her business card. "Ethan, please help. My daughter is dying," shouted Adriana into the phone. "I'll be right there. Call an ambulance. Hurry, please." Adriana couldn't find a place to go. She hurriedly gathered the necessary things for herself and the baby and rushed downstairs with her daughter in her arms to wait for the ambulance. Ethan arrived at the same time as the ambulance and ordered them to take the girl to the cardiac center where he worked. David didn't come out to the noise. Apparently, he was fast asleep after taking another drink. "What's wrong with the baby?" she asked Ethan when he and the professor left the room. "The situation is complicated. The girl has a heart defect. Did any of your relatives have a similar condition?" asked the professor. "Yes, my mom," answered Adriana with trembling lips. "The girl needs an urgent operation. Do you give your consent?" "Yes, of course. Then we need to sign the necessary documents and start the preparations," declared the professor. At that moment, the phone rang in Adriana's pocket. "How dare you leave with the child without my knowledge?" shouted into the phone husband. "My daughter needs help, and I as a mother will do everything possible for this. We will not return to your house. I'll file for divorce myself." Adriana said what she had wanted to say for a long time. "What did you say? Divorce? There's one thing you haven't considered, dear. According to the papers, I'm the father of the child, and with my connections, I could easily take her away from you." "You can't do that." Adriana turned pale, realizing the trap she had fallen into. "You're wrong. That's why it's in your best interest to go back. Otherwise, though, you'll see," said David and disconnected. Clutching the phone, Adriana felt a ringing in her ears and her eyes went dark. Ethan picked up the fainting woman and carried her to his office. Adriana woke up and smelled a pungent odor. "I really need your help." In a pleading tone, she began the conversation. Ethan nodded silently. "We have to register Emily under a false name, or he'll find us." Ethan didn't ask any more questions, but within an hour she had the child's card with the changed personal data. Adriana stayed with her daughter the whole time she was preparing for the operation, only leaving to wash or eat. Ethan was always there too. He knew that David was looking for his wife all over the city, but he didn't tell Adriana. The most important thing now was the outcome of the surgery. The girl had been operated on by one of the best cardiologists in the city. Ethan had assisted. The few hours that Emily was in the operating room seemed to Adriana like an eternity. And only when Ethan informed her that the worst was over and the operation was successful, Adriana was able to breathe out. she cried, throwing herself into Ethan's arms. "Emily, isn't she my daughter?" He asked a sobbing Adriana, gently stroking her hair. She nodded, and he pressed her even tighter. Later, sitting in the hospital cafe, the young people were drinking coffee and listening to the radio. Suddenly, the music was interrupted by an urgent news bulletin. It was reported about a major fire of one of the houses in an elite village of the city. Adriana was horrified to hear her father's address. Her father had died in the fire, suffocated and could not get out. Christina was badly injured and was in the hospital. Adriana rushed to her. The woman said that it was probably arson because the doors of the house were propped up from the outside. Because of this, they could not get out. She also told of a letter she had kept for Adriana. "The letter was from your aunt. Don't swear, but I opened it. But I guess I've had to. It burned, but I read it. Your aunt has been ill lately, but her soul kept longing for you. She wanted to see you. She called many times. Only James forbade her to see you. He told her not to mess with your head. So she sent you a letter in pain. No one but me saw it. She bequeathed you a house in the village. She asked you not to abandon it, and at the end, she signed it. I hope you will find true happiness at your roots." Christina was silent and closed her eyes. Adriana cried quietly. Suddenly, she saw through the window David's car in the parking lot. She rushed down the hall, looking for an emergency exit, because Ethan was waiting for her in the car. "Hurry up and find me," Adriana shouted, and the car started whistling. The mirror showed that David's Jeep was following them. "God, he won't spare us. Hurry, Ethan, please," she prayed. David was gaining on them. One more leap, and he could have blocked their path. But as fate would have it, there was a fox in the oncoming lane, and David's car slammed into it at full speed. Ethan and Adriana were sitting in the emergency room. "He wants to see you," the nurse announced. Adriana did not boldly enter the room where David was lying. He looked pathetic now. There were tubes literally everywhere, but he was conscious. "My only regret is that I didn't finish what I started," he hissed. "Why do you hate me so much? What am I doing to you? Because you're his daughter and you had to suffer. Like me, he met my mother before you were born. I was a little boy then. He tamed me. I adored him. And so did my mother. Then he met your mother and easily threw us out of his life. Mom couldn't take it anymore and started drinking. I was raised by relatives. All this time I was hatching a revenge plan and following his life. You were born with a golden spoon in your mouth. You had everything, money, loving parents. I had nothing at all, you know." David looked contemptuously at the surprised Adriana. "And then I set a goal to succeed, to trample your family, and I almost succeeded." Adriana did not listen anymore, but silently left the room. David survived, but became an invalid, confined to a wheelchair. He was being cared for by Betty, a friend of Adriana's. As it turned out, she had long been in love with him and had even dated him. At first, she was terribly jealous of Adriana, but after getting to know her better, she became warm to her and tried to dissuade David from his devious plans. A month later, Adriana and Ethan took the girl home from the hospital. They were on their way to their new home in the countryside, the one that bound their lives together forever. They were happy to be back to their roots,